The shot rang out across the frozen valley like a crack in the world. A woman stood alone on a farmhouse porch. December midnight. No lantern. No one coming to help. Just her, a Winchester, and two men down by the creek with a sledgehammer aimed at the one stone marker that stood between her and losing everything. She didn't flinch. The barrel didn't waver. Inside the house, 15 red flannel shirts hung waiting on their pegs, each one sewn in secret, each one carrying a debt she hadn't asked for, a scheme she wasn't supposed to survive, and a truth that one man in this valley had bet his fortune she would never discover. She had discovered it. Down by the creek a lantern swung. The sledgehammer rose. She pulled the hammer back. The bitter wind came down off the Laramie Range. Like it had a personal grievance with Harlan's Crossing, stripping the last brown leaves from the cottonwoods along the creek and sending them skittering across the frozen ruts of Main Street. November of 1883 had arrived the way hard things always arrived in Wyoming territory, without warning, without apology, just there suddenly, the way debt was, the way widowhood was, the way another winter was when a woman had already survived 2 of them alone and wasn't entirely certain she had the constitution for a third. Nora Hale knew the cold before she opened her door. She knew it the way her hands knew it, the way her back knew it from hauling firewood at first light, the way the farmhouse walls knew it, groaning faintly in the pre-dawn, dark like old men rising from bad sleep. She had been awake since 4. She was always awake since 4. Sleep was a luxury that belonged to women whose roofs didn't leak and whose loan balances didn't compound in the dark. She stood at the small mirror nailed beside the kitchen window and pinned her hair into its net with the efficiency of a woman who had stopped performing for mirrors some time ago. The hair net was black. The bodice was brown. The cuffs already buttoned. The wool skirt was gray, the color of creek water in January, and it had been let down twice at the hem and would not survive another letting. She knew this. She had known it since August. She had filed the knowledge away beside the other things she knew and could not immediately fix, which was a drawer that had gotten considerably full in the 3 years since Thomas died. The boots went on last. Leather, dark brown, resoled once by the cobbler in Cartwright 2 springs ago. They were good boots still. Thomas had bought them the year before he got sick, and she had taken excellent care of them the way she took excellent care of everything she could not afford to replace. The left one had a small crack beginning at the toe seam that she had treated twice with neat's foot oil and was watching the way you watched a fence post in wet ground, orally, constantly. She lifted her coin purse from the shelf above the stove and counted what was inside without looking. Her fingers knew the coins by weight and edge. $3.47. Enough for the oats and the lard. Enough for the harness buckle Miles Corbett had set aside for her 3 weeks ago when she'd asked him to, back when she'd still thought she might have money for it by now. She would tell Miles she needed another week on the buckle. He would nod. He was a decent man that way, Miles Corbett. He kept things set aside longer than any reasonable business arrangement required, because he was too soft-hearted to say so plainly and too proud to admit he was doing it as a kindness. The road into town was 2 miles of frozen mud and wind. She took it the way she always took it. On foot, because the horse was getting on in years and the ground this hard was bad on his joints, and because 2 miles was nothing to a woman who had walked every decision of her life the same way, 1 foot in front of the other, looking at where she was going rather than where she'd been. Harlan's Crossing sat in the shallow cup of the valley, like something that had been put down by accident and then stayed because the soil was decent and the creek ran year-round. 60-some families, a church, a bank, a smithy that smelled of coal and hot iron for half a mile in every direction. The mercantile, where Miles Corbett sold everything from axle grease to imported ribbon, and where the stove in the corner burned from October through April, and the smell of wood smoke and dried goods and the particular ordinary comfort of a warm building was enough to make a person stand in the doorway longer than necessary just breathing it in. Nora did not stand in the doorway. She was not a woman who lingered over small comforts. That was the thing about poverty that nobody who hadn't lived it understood clearly. It didn't make you grateful for small things. It made you precise. Every moment had a cost. Every stop had a purpose. She pushed through the door, felt the warmth hit her face, and moved immediately toward the counter where Miles kept his scale and his till. Miles was in the back, by the sound of it, moving crates. She could hear the scrape of wood on wood. 2 other women were already in the store, one examining a bolt of muslin near the window and another she didn't know well, a rancher's wife from out past Ridgeline Creek, holding up a tin of baking powder and squinting at the label. Nora nodded to them both and began counting her coins onto the glass counter, organizing them by denomination, stacking them into their purpose. 1/2 a sack of oats, 1 tin of lard. She had already decided against the harness buckle. She had already decided against the paper she needed for writing, which could wait, and against the additional tin of lamp oil, which would have to wait too, because the days were getting shorter, and she had been rationing the oil since October. She had already decided against a lot of things that morning before she left the house. Decision-making was something she did in the cold and the dark before she walked anywhere, so that she would not have to make them standing in a public place where her face might say something she didn't intend. Miles came out from the back, tightening his apron. His face was a good face, round and florid and honest. He was the kind of man who had opinions about weather and livestock, and almost no opinions about anything else, which made him restful to deal with. He saw her coins and nodded, reaching for the oat sack without needing to be told because she bought the same quantities, and he had the memory of a man whose livelihood depended on knowing what his customers needed before they asked. "Morning, Nora." He swung the oat sack onto the scale. She told him good morning and asked him to put the buckle back in general stock. She said it plainly without explanation or apology because an explanation would have made it worse for both of them. Miles didn't blink. "I'll hold it another week. Storm coming anyway, nobody's going anywhere." He said this as if he hadn't heard her tell him to put it back, which she was fairly certain he had heard, and was choosing to override in the quiet way decent men did when they disagreed with you, but were too polite to say so directly. She did not argue. She noted the kindness and filed it away in a different drawer, the drawer of things she owed and intended to repay. The door opened behind her. The cold came in like a hand pressing flat against the back of her neck, and with it came the rustle of heavy fabric, the particular swishing authority of silk skirts, and the smell of rose water that cost more per ounce than Nora's lamp oil for a month. Clara Dodd, and beside her, Ruth Ames, who was Clara's shadow in the way that certain women attached themselves to women more powerful than themselves, and reflected their light back with interest. Clara Dodd was the wife of Fletcher Dodd, who ran the Harlan's Crossing Bank with the warmth of a man who genuinely preferred numbers to people, and found the people mostly an inconvenience that the numbers unfortunately required. Clara was 51 tall, with the straight spine of a woman who had never once questioned whether she deserved to take up space. Her coat was trimmed in dark fur at the collar and cuffs. Her hat was pinned with 3 dyed feathers, amber and rust and deep green, the colors of a season she could afford to find decorative. Her button boots had never been resoled. Ruth Ames was smaller, rounder, quicker to laugh at things that weren't quite funny, the kind of laugh that was really just agreement with a sound attached. Nora moved slightly to the side, making room because the counter was narrow and she was nearly finished, and there was no reason to occupy more space than she needed. This was not deference. This was efficiency. There was a difference, and Nora knew the difference even if nobody else in the room was making it. Clara paused near the far end of the fabric display. Her eyes moved across the bolts with the practiced assessment of a woman who bought fabric frequently and knew what she was looking at. Then they stopped. On the bolt of red flannel. It had come in on the freight wagon from St. Louis 2 weeks prior, and Miles had put it at the end of the display because the color was impossible to ignore, and good placement sold fabric faster than any other technique in a town this size. It was a deep, clear red, the red of embers rather than flames, dense and soft and finely woven, the kind of fabric that looked warm from 10 feet away. Nora had noticed it the first time she came in after it arrived. She had not touched it. She had not priced it. She had noted it the way she noted many things, precisely and without sentiment and without dwelling. Clara touched it, drew her gloved fingers slowly along the top edge of the bolt. "Remarkable," she said, to no one in particular, which meant to everyone in the room. It's the nicest thing Miles has had in months. I was thinking of having a winter coat made up, perhaps a riding jacket as well." Ruth Ames made a sound of agreement and admiration. 40 yards, she said, having apparently already examined the bolt before Nora noticed. "You could do both and still have fabric left." "At $4 a yard from St. Louis, I expect I could," Clara agreed. She let her hand rest flat on the fabric, a gesture that was somehow simultaneously casual and possessive, the gesture of a woman who touched things she intended to own. Then Clara turned, and her eyes found Nora. The look traveled. It was unhurried. It started at the top, at the hairnet, at the wisps of blonde going gray at the temples, and it went slowly down, the way an assessor's eyes went down, cataloging and appraising, taking in the bodice with its copper buttons and its careful mending at the left cuff, the wool skirt and its twice-let hem, and the unforgiving arithmetic of a garment that had been worn too long and altered too many times to pretend otherwise, and it ended at the boots, at the left boot and the crack at the toe seam that Nora had treated with neat's foot oil and watched like a fence post in wet ground. Clara smiled. It was a smile that had nothing warm in it. It was the smile of a woman who had found the answer to a question she hadn't needed to ask aloud. "What beautiful fabric," Clara said, returning her gaze to the red flannel. The compliment was addressed to the bolt, not to Nora, not to anyone who couldn't afford it, though I suppose it isn't practical for everyone. She let this rest in the air for a moment, that careful half-sentence, and then, as if the thought had simply continued naturally, "Some things are meant for people who know how to wear them properly. Don't you think, Ruth?" Ruth Ames covered her mouth. The laugh was small and bright and entirely deliberate. "Well, it does require a certain... I mean, you wouldn't want to. It does show everything, doesn't it, that red? Every line, every wear mark." She paused, the pause of a woman who had just said the thing she'd been building toward. Not every woman has the situation for it. The room had gone quiet in that particular way. Rooms went quiet when something was happening that everyone could feel but no one wanted to acknowledge. Miles Corbett had stopped moving crates. The woman with the baking powder had gone very still. Nora's hands were on the counter, flat, beside her coin stacks. She did not move. She did not look at Clara Dodd. She looked at the coins on the counter, at the careful columns she had made of them, and she breathed once, slowly, through her nose, and she thought about the Colonel Harlan Hale's voice, which she had not heard in 5 years but still knew exactly how it sounded. "Shoulders back, Nora Elaine. You are a Hale, we do not bend in public." She lifted the coin stacks and placed them back into her purse, one denomination at a time because she had counted them out and it would be wasteful to mix them. She picked up her parcel when Miles slid it across the counter, the oats and the lard wrapped in brown paper and tied with a length of cord. She turned. She did not look at Clara Dodd directly, not because she couldn't, but because Clara Dodd was not worth the angle of her chin. "Good morning," Nora said to the room in general, to Miles specifically, with the same tone she used for weather reports and fence-line discussions, the tone of a woman whose day was continuing and whose time was accounted for. And she walked to the door, and she opened it, and she stepped out into the cold. The wind was waiting for her, sharp and immediate and honest in the way cold was always honest. Her eyes stung. She blinked once, she kept walking. Behind her, the door swung closed, and she heard, faint and muffled through the thick wood, Ruth Ames's laugh. Quick, small, the sound of someone confirming what had just happened. Nora's boots hit the frozen boards of the sidewalk in an even rhythm, right, left. She was 32 years old, and the granddaughter of Colonel Harlan Hale, who had brought 61 families across 300 miles of open territory in the spring of 1861, who had laid the first survey stakes for this town with his own hands, who had named it after himself not out of vanity, but because when the vote came, and nobody could agree, and the children were crying, and the horses were exhausted, it had been quicker to name it after the man who'd gotten them there than to spend another 3 days arguing about it. And this town that bore his name on the painted sign at the edge of the road, had just laughed at her boots. She was past the bank before she let herself feel it, past the smithy, past the feed store where old Hector Pell was loading grain sacks onto a wagon and didn't look up. She turned onto the side road that ran along the creek toward the south road home, And she stopped walking, and she stood for a moment with her parcel under her arm, and her purse in her fist, and the wind pulling at her hairnet, and she pressed her lips together very tightly. She did not cry. She had decided some time ago, in the practical accounting of her daily life, that crying was an expenditure she could not afford on a Tuesday morning 2 miles from home in the middle of November. She had made a similar decision about self-pity. Both were filed in the drawer beside the harness buckle and the lamp oil. Available in theory, not accessed presently. She started walking again, one foot in front of the other. She did not notice, because she had not been looking, the man who had been standing in the far corner of the mercantile near the iron stove, the one who had come in from the cold 15 minutes before her, and had been waiting for Miles to finish with a freight invoice, and had been standing quietly the way very large men in small spaces learn to stand, taking up as little presence as they could manage, which in his case was not very little, but was at least contained. Silas Thorn had heard every word. He was not a man who announced himself in rooms. This was partly disposition, and partly the practical reality that a man who stood 6'4" in his stocking feet and had the shoulder width of a working ranch gate learned early that announcing himself was unnecessary. Rooms already knew he was there. The floorboards told them. The way the air shifted when he walked through a doorway told them. He had stopped making entrances somewhere around the age of 22 and had been making arrivals ever since, which was a different thing entirely. He was wearing what he always wore when he came to town. The canvas duster, the color of old ash, that he'd bought in Cheyenne 6 years ago, and had never replaced because it still kept the weather off. And he had no vanity about clothing. The flannel shirt beneath it was a dark reddish brown, the color of creek clay. The leather chaps were worn smooth on the inner thighs from years of riding. The wide brim hat was pushed back slightly on his head, a habit he'd developed indoors to avoid looking like he was about to leave, which he often was. His gloves were leather, creased and darkened with use. He was 38 years old and looked like what he was, which was a man who spent the majority of his life outdoors doing physical work, which was at least half true, the outdoor part being accurate and the physical work being somewhat less accurate these days than it had been 10 years ago. Now that he employed 40 men to do the work he used to do himself, and spent more of his time than he cared to admit reading freight contracts and rail correspondence and balance sheets. He had heard the women come in. He had heard the rustle and the rosewater and the particular quality of Clara Dodd's greeting, which was the greeting of a woman who expected everyone in a room to reorient toward her arrival. He had heard the conversation at the fabric counter. He had heard the laugh. He had not moved. He had not made a sound. He had looked at his hat brim and breathed and done the thing he did when he felt something in his chest that wanted to become words, which was to wait until the something settled into something more useful. He watched Nora Hale go out the door. He watched how she walked, straight, deliberate. The walk of a woman who was not going to let anyone behind her see what the last 2 minutes had cost. He looked at the red flannel. He looked at Clara Dodd, who had turned back to the bolt and was smoothing it with her palm, already moving on from what she'd done to the business of what she wanted. Silas turned toward the counter. Miles Corbett had appeared from somewhere in the vicinity of the back room, the kind of appearing that men did when things became uncomfortable and they wanted to look as though they had been busy the whole time. Miles. Silas's voice was low. It had the quality of distant weather about it, not threatening but very present. Miles looked up, adjusted his apron. Yes, Mr. Thorn. The red flannel. Silas pointed. How many yards on that bolt? Miles glanced at the bolt. 40 yards, give or take. Just came in from I'll take all of it. The room changed. It changed the way rooms did when something happened that nobody had anticipated, and everyone needed a moment to recalibrate. Ruth Ames turned from the window. The woman with the baking powder looked up. Miles blinked, his hand already reaching toward the bolt, the way hands reached for things out of reflex before the brain had fully processed the instruction. Clara Dodd turned around. The smile was still present, but something had shifted behind it. A small rearrangement of certainty. Mr. Thorn, Clara said, with the pleasant measured tone of a woman who was not accustomed to being interrupted by commerce. I was about to inquire about several yards of that for my own use. Silas looked at her. Not rudely, not with any particular expression. just looked at her with the flat, considering steadiness of a man who had been waiting a long time to look at her in exactly this way. "You were," he said. He reached into the inside pocket of his canvas duster and brought out a roll of greenbacks, the kind of roll that suggested a man who carried cash not for display, but because cash was simpler than credit, and he'd been in enough situations where simpler was necessary. He counted out bills onto the counter in front of Miles without looking at the bills, because he knew what was in his hand by touch, the way Nora had known her coins. "You were too busy to open your purse." Clara Dodd's breath went in. Her chin came up. The color in her face changed. Ruth Ames made no sound at all. Silas laid the bills flat. "Wrap the whole bolt, Miles. Load it on my wagon." Miles was already moving. He was a man who understood which direction things were going and moved in that direction. Silas put his hat on fully, the brim settling low, and he walked to the door. He did not look at Clara Dodd again. He pushed through the door and the cold received him, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. Looking down the side road that ran along the creek, he could still see her. 200 yards, maybe a little more, her gray wool skirt visible against the dead grass of the creek bank, moving south at the steady pace of a woman who had somewhere to be and was getting there. He didn't follow her. Not immediately. He was not a man who acted on instinct where planning would serve better, and he did not yet know what he intended to do, only that he intended something, and that the intention was connected to the way she had walked out that door and the way she had not looked at Clara Dodd when she left. He untied his horse from the post. He walked the horse up the street to the bank, which was what he had come to town to do in the first place, before the flannel and the laugh and the straight-backed walk of Nora Hale had rearranged his morning. Fletcher Dodd was behind his desk when Silas came through the bank door, and his face assembled itself in the professional welcome that it assembled for anyone who walked through his door, which was the welcome of a man who valued deposits and would pretend to value people, if that was what the deposits required. He was 54 years old, with the pallor of a man who spent his working life in a building with one window, and his hair was oiled flat, and his vest was black wool, and his watch chain was gold, and his handshake, when he offered it, was the handshake of a man who had decided early in life that handshakes were transactions. Silas did not sit. He stood in front of the desk with his hat still on and asked to see the Hale account. Fletcher Dodd's welcome rearranged itself. Not disappeared. Rearranged. Into the slightly smaller, slightly more careful welcome of a man who had just been asked for something he had not expected to give. "I'm afraid the bank's accounts are private matters, Mr. Thorn. A matter of policy." He said the word policy, the way small men said it when they wanted it to feel larger. Silas put his hands on the desk. Not aggressively. He just put them there, those two large, calloused, round, pollard-worn hands, flat on the polished mahogany, and then he let the silence sit between them. For the length of time it took Fletcher Dodd to understand that policies were things that applied to men who didn't control the majority of the county's cattle economy. Fletcher Dodd opened a drawer. He removed a ledger. He turned the heavy pages and slid it across the desk. Silas looked at it. He read it the way he read everything, carefully, linearly, without expression, starting at the beginning and not skipping. The original loan had been $200, taken out by Thomas Hale in the spring of 1879, to buy seed and repair the east barn wall after the winter had taken a section of it. Thomas Hale had died the following winter. The loan had passed to his widow. The balance at the bottom of the page was $430. Silas read the page again. He traced the column of additions. 3 late penalties for payments that were, when he looked at the original amounts against the penalty triggers, short by between $2 and $5. 1 fee labeled property assessment, dated 8 months after Thomas Hale's death, with no corresponding record of an assessment having been conducted. 1 fee labeled account maintenance, which had no contractual basis that he could see in the original loan terms. The compound interest had been applied to the balance after each penalty addition, which was not technically illegal in the territory, but which required a specific clause in the original agreement that he could not find on the page in front of him. He looked at Dodd. "What authorization did you have for the property assessment fee?" Dodd straightened his spectacles. Standard practice for a property-secured loan when the primary account holder is deceased. The bank must protect its investment. There's no assessment record. The documentation may be misfiled. It may be. Silas looked back at the ledger. And this maintenance fee. Where is that in the original loan agreement? Dodd shifted his weight. The loan terms were updated in 1881. Standard account maintenance provisions were added across all agricultural accounts. Who signed the update for the Hale account? Dodd was quiet for a moment. The update was administrative. It did not require individual signatures. Silas closed the ledger. The sound was decisive. He reached into his duster and brought out the roll of greenbacks again, peeled off bills without theater, and laid $430 on top of the closed ledger. The debt is paid, he said. Write the receipt. Dodd stared at the money. His face had gone through several phases and had arrived at something that was not quite pale and not quite composed. Mr. Thorn, this is highly irregular. You have no legal standing to satisfy another party's. Write the receipt, Fletcher. Dodd picked up his pen. His hand did not tremble exactly, but it moved with the excess of care that hands moved with when their owners were working to keep them steady. He wrote the receipt. He stamped it. He pushed it across the desk. Silas folded it and put it in his coat pocket. He leaned slightly forward, not enough to be threatening, enough to be perfectly clear. If I find that you have added any further fees to any account held by a working family in this valley without full contractual authority, he said, his voice no higher than it had been, no harder, just carrying the same flat quality that the wide Wyoming sky carried, something that went a long distance without effort. I will pull every dollar of Rimrock Ranch's deposits out of this building, and I will speak personally to every rancher in the herd association about where they keep their money. He let that sit. Fletcher Dodd looked at the money on the ledger. He looked at the receipt. He looked at Silas Thorn, who was already turning toward the door. That is not a threat, Silas said, settling his hat. That is a business decision. He walked out into the cold. He stood for a moment on the bank's wooden steps, letting the air clear his head, and he looked out at the street and thought about thy receipt in his pocket, and what he intended to do with it, and how he intended to explain it to a woman who had told him she was not interested in charity before he had even offered her anything. He walked back to the mercantile. Miles had the flannel wrapped in a length of burlap and tied with rope, a cylinder of red so heavy it took both of Miles's arms to lift it. Silas loaded it into the wagon bed himself. It was not especially heavy for him. He was aware, as he had always been somewhat uncomfortably aware, that one of the side effects of being the size he was that things that were genuinely difficult for other men simply were not difficult for him, which had a way of making people underestimate both the effort involved in the thing and the capability of the people, for whom the effort was real. He drove the wagon south along the creek road. He could reconstruct her pace from the time he'd been in the bank. He knew approximately how long he had been in with Dodd, and he knew approximately how far 2 miles was at the pace she'd been walking. He caught sight of her before the first bend in the road, still moving south, still straight-backed, her parcel under one arm, her chin down against the wind rather than her spirit, just against the practical cold. He did not call out. He pulled the wagon alongside her and slowed the horses to match her pace and said nothing for a moment, just let the wagon creak beside her until she looked up. She looked at him with an expression that was measuring and unsurprised and slightly wary, the expression of a woman who had learned to assess unexpected arrivals quickly. Mr. Thorn. Her voice was level, not warm, not cold. Level, Mrs. Hale. He tipped his hat against the wind. She looked at the wagon. She looked at the burlap-wrapped cylinder in the back. She looked at him. The look was reading him. He could feel it. The way competent people's looks felt when they were actually looking rather than just seeing. I have room on the wagon, he said, if you're going south. I'm going south. Then, get up. She hesitated, not from indecision, from the particular hesitation of a woman who had decided at some point to be very careful about what she accepted from people and why, and who was applying that carefulness in real time. Then she climbed up onto the bench, parcel in her lap, and settled herself with the minimal movement of a person who was not going to take up more space than was necessary. He snapped the reins. The horses moved. They went a quarter mile without talking. which was fine. Silas was not a man who filled silences from discomfort. He had grown up in silences, worked in them, built a ranch out of them. Silence was just the thing between words, and sometimes it carried more than words did. "The flannel is for my cowboys," he said eventually. "Winter shirts. 15 of them. I need someone who can sew to a proper size and won't rush the work." She turned to look at him. The wind had pulled a strand of hair out of the net, and it crossed her face, and she pushed it back with one hand, in a gesture that was too practical to be self-conscious. "I sew," she said. "I know. Miles told me. And I saw your cuff." She looked at her left cuff, the mending at the seam, the place she had matched the thread so carefully that you had to look for the repair to find it. Her expression said she was recalibrating something about him. "I pay fair wages," he said. "I'd need measurements from each man first. Hank Deaver will bring them by. He won't be trouble. I don't take work I can't finish properly. I don't want work finished improperly." She was quiet again, calculating. He could tell she was calculating because the look she was giving the road in front of them was not actually about the road. "And the flannel," she said. "It's my fabric. I'll use what I need for the shirts. Whatever yardage is left over, I'd like you to have for your own use. Consider it the first payment on the contract." She was very still beside him. "Then I don't need gifts, Mr. Thorn. It's a signing bonus. Standard practice in a large contract. That flannel came from St. Louis. It's $4 a yard. I'm aware of what I paid for it. That is not a signing bonus. That is a gift dressed up in business language to make it easier for me to accept it." He felt the corner of his mouth move. He controlled it. "You could interpret it that way. I am interpreting it that way. Or," he said, "you could interpret it as a man who bought 40 yards of fabric he has no use for, and needs to turn it into something practical, and who is hiring a seamstress who needs material, and who finds the intersection of those two facts to be a reasonably efficient arrangement." She looked at him. He looked at the road. The horses moved. The wind came through the cottonwoods with a sound like something trying to remember a song. "Why did you buy it?" she said. Not the question she'd asked before. A different one. The real one. He was quiet for long enough that it was clear he was going to answer, and was choosing how. "Because I was in the room," he said. "And so were you. And I heard what was said." She looked forward. Her jaw had a set to it that was not anger exactly. Something harder than anger and more durable. "That happens," she said, which was not an argument or a complaint, just a statement of fact, the way people stated facts about weather. "It happens." "It shouldn't," he said. "No," she said. "It shouldn't." She paused. "But buying the flannel doesn't stop it from happening again." "No," he agreed. "It just means Harriet Crane doesn't get to wear it while it does." She made a sound then. Not quite a laugh. Something shorter than a laugh, but made of the same material. She looked away from him, out at the creek, at the brown grass and the ice forming at the edges of the water, and whatever the sound was, she let it go before it became something larger. The farmhouse came into view around the next bend. He knew it was hers before she said anything, because it matched what he'd constructed from what he knew. The farmhouse was small, square, wood-sided, the paint weathered to the color of old bone in patches, but applied to begin with someone's care, which showed in the places it had held. The porch roof dipped on the left side. The yard was swept. The firewood was stacked against the north wall, in rows that were straight enough to have been done by someone who found satisfaction in straightness, or perhaps just in the fact that wood stacked right didn't fall over in wind. He stopped the horses at the gate. He climbed down and lifted the burlap-wrapped flannel from the wagon bed, without being asked, and carried it to the bottom of the porch steps, because that was as far as he would take it without an invitation, and he did not intend to invite himself further. She came around the front of the horses and stood at the porch steps and looked at the flannel and then at him. "Mr. Thorn," she said, "I want to be clear. I don't accept charity. If I take this work, I take it as a business arrangement. Honest wages for honest work. Nothing more. That is exactly what I am offering." She studied him the way she had studied the receipt for things misfiled, looking for the line that didn't match. "Why do you really want someone out here to sew?" she said. "Rimrock Ranch has hands who ride into town. They could take fabric to the seamstress in Cartwright." He considered this. The seamstress in Cartwright makes shirts that fit the way I make pastry, he said. Badly and with visible effort. He paused. Miles Corbett told me you were the best on this side of the ridge. I need shirts that fit. My men work hard and they need gear that works with them. She looked at him one more time, that long assessing look. Then she said, I'll need to know what measurements you want before Hank Deaver comes by. I'll have him bring a list. And I won't rush the work. I already told you I didn't want it rushed. She nodded, once. The nod of a woman who had made a decision and was not going to revisit it. She took the burlap end of the flannel roll in both hands. He stepped forward to help. She said nothing, but she let him carry it to the porch, and she held the door, and she let him set it inside against the wall, just inside the entrance. Then she stood in the doorway. He went back to the wagon. He climbed up. He gathered the reins, Mr. Thorn. He turned. She was still in the doorway, her hand on the door frame. The cold was coming in past her, and she didn't seem to notice or minded it less than most people did. You didn't answer my question. The real one. Why you bought it? He looked at her in the doorway. At the gray wool and the copper buttons, and the hair net, slightly displaced by wind, and the face of a woman who had walked 2 miles in November and been laughed at, and walked back out the door without flinching. I have a ranch that employs 40 men, he said. I've been to most of the territory and back. I know what useful looks like. He paused. I know what waste looks like too. What was in that store this morning was waste. I don't like waste. She was very still. Then, that's one answer. It's the only one I have right now, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, slowly, and something in her face changed the way things changed when a calculation came out differently than expected. Not surprise. Recalibration. He snapped the reins. The horses started moving. He didn't look back. But he heard Hank Deaver's voice before he'd gone 50 yards, his foreman coming up the track from the east pasture on horseback, and Hank fell into pace beside the wagon and said, with the particular neutrality of a man who had known Silas Thorn for 11 years, and understood that neutrality was the appropriate gear for this kind of conversation. How'd it go in town, boss? Silas kept his eyes on the road. He reached into the inside pocket of his canvas duster and felt the receipt there, folded in thirds, the paper slightly warm from being next to his body. Hank, he said, you know those 2 men you've seen near the creek line at the Hale property? The ones with the surveying equipment. Hank was quiet for a moment. The ones I told you about on Tuesday. 3 times this week now. Who are they working for? Another pause. Hank had the cowboy's instinct for the weight of a question before answering it. Haven't gotten close enough to ask directly, but the horses they were riding. Both shod with the same pattern. I've seen that pattern at the rail survey camp east of Ridgeline. Silas watched the road unroll in front of him. The creek ran alongside it for another half-mile before the road bent west, and the cottonwoods threw bare winter shadows across the frozen mud, and the sky was the color of old pewter from horizon to horizon. Men with surveying equipment on private land, Silas said quietly, are never lost. Hank said nothing, because Hank was a man who knew when a statement was complete. That evening, 2 miles south of where Silas Thorn was eating his supper, in the big empty kitchen of the Rimrock Ranch house, Nora Hale sat at her kitchen table with the bolt of red flannel unrolled across half the surface, running her hands along the weave. The lamp was turned up as high as she allowed herself, and in that light the fabric was the color of something that should not have been sitting in her farmhouse, but was indisputably sitting there. She pulled a length of it across her lap and held it up to the light. The weave was tight. The color ran even all the way through. This was not the flannel she bought when she could afford flannel. This was something else. This was the kind of material that changed what a garment was. Not just what it looked like, but what it was, what it did, what it said about the person wearing it. She thought about Clara Dodd's hands on it in the mercantile, smoothing it, claiming it with her palm. She thought about Silas Thorn's voice, the particular flatness of it when he'd said, "You were too busy to open your purse." She reached into her sewing box for her shears. She found the good pair. She set them beside the fabric. She didn't cut yet. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and looked at the red and thought about what she was going to do with the additional yardage, the part that wasn't contracted for shirts, the part that was, by his telling, hers. She thought about it for a while. Then she picked up the shears and got to work. Half a mile away on the main road into town, in the room above the Harlan's Crossing bank, where Fletcher Dodd kept his private office, a lamp burned late. On the desk was a map. It was a careful map, hand-drawn in the rail surveyor's precise style, with a red line that ran from east to west across the valley floor, crossing the creek in 3 places. The longest and most central crossing was at the 40-acre property currently registered to Nora Hale, widow of Thomas Hale, 3 years in default management, balance $430. Fletcher Dodd looked at where the red line crossed the creek. He looked at where the creek ran through the Hale property. He looked at the water rights notation on the deed copy he had obtained through the county register. He tapped the map twice with one finger, slowly, methodically. He reached for a pen. Hank Deaver arrived on Thursday morning with a list written in the cramped, careful hand of a man who had learned to write late and took it seriously. He tied his horse at the gate post and knocked twice on the doorframe with one knuckle, the knock of a man who had been raised to treat other people's thresholds with respect. And when Nora opened the door, he took his hat off immediately and held it in both hands in front of him like a man in church. He was broad. Not as broad as Silas Thorn, because almost nobody was as broad as Silas Thorn, but broad in the way of men who had spent 20 years doing the kind of work that built the body without asking its opinion. His face was the color and texture of old saddle leather, deeply lined around the eyes from squinting into sun and wind, and his hair was iron gray at the temples and still dark brown in the center, which gave him the look of a man whose head hadn't fully committed to aging yet. He handed her the list without preamble. She looked at it. 15 names, each followed by 3 numbers, chest, shoulder, sleeve, written in inches. At the bottom in slightly larger letters that suggested they had been added after the rest, boss wants the collars standing, not folded, high enough to block wind at the neck. He's particular about that. She asked how long Silas Thorn had been particular about collar height. Hank looked at his hat brim and then at the middle distance in the way of a man deciding how much to say. Long as I've known him. And that's 11 years. He lost a man to exposure 8 winters back. Good man. Young. Collar wasn't right on his coat. Seam had split. He didn't say anything about it. After that, the boss got particular. Nora looked at the list again. The name at the top was Hank Deaver. The numbers next to it were generous. She asked if he'd measured himself or if someone else had. He admitted that Silas had measured him. She asked if that had been a comfortable experience. Hank said it was about as comfortable as being measured for a coffin, except that you at least knew the coffin was going to fit. She told him to tell Mr. Thorn she would start with the pattern work that afternoon and have the first 2 shirts ready for fitting within the week. Hank nodded, put his hat back on with the precise placement of a man who had a relationship with his hat, and untied his horse. He was halfway down the road before he turned back in the saddle. He called out that the boss had said to tell her the measurements for the biggest man on the crew were his own, in case she wondered. He paused, and his chest is 48 inches. Just so she wasn't surprised when she cut the fabric. She stood in the doorway and looked at the list and at the number 48 and revised several things she had been thinking. The first shirt took her 2 evenings. She cut the pattern in the afternoon, the red flannel moving under her shears with the specific give of well-made fabric that had been woven by people who understood their work. She basted the seams by lamplight after supper, checking the collar points twice before she was satisfied. And she thought about the man who had gotten particular about collar seams 8 winters back because a good young man hadn't said his coat was split and had paid for the silence with his life. She thought about what kind of employer made a mental accounting of that. What kind of man carried it 11 years later in the specifications he gave a seamstress. She told herself this was professional interest. Understanding the client's requirements. This was, she felt, mostly true. The 2nd day of December she went out to check the creekside fence line in the afternoon, which she did every week, because the wire had a tendency to loosen at the 3rd post from the old oak, and she had not yet been able to afford to replace that section, and keeping up with it was cheaper than letting it go. The sky was the particular pewter white of snow, thinking about itself, not yet committed. The creek was icing at the margins and running dark and quick in the center, the way it ran in hard winter, with a focused energy that seemed almost purposeful. She saw them before they saw her. 2 men on the far side of the creek, on the slope that was technically still her land before the survey mark at the old lightning-struck pine. One of them had a tripod with an instrument mounted on it, a transit, the kind that surveyors used for precise angle measurements. The other was holding a measuring rod and looking at the near bank of the creek with the focused, professional attention of a man being paid to look at things. She stood still for a moment and watched them. They were not neighbors. She knew every man within 5 miles by sight, and these were neither of them. The one with the transit was heavy-set, wearing a brown wool coat and a flat crown hat. The one with the rod was younger, thinner, with a canvas jacket that was not warm enough for December in Wyoming and the slightly hunched posture of a man who knew it. She crossed the creek at the flat stones 20 yards upstream and walked toward them without hurrying, because hurrying changed the approach, and she wanted the approach to say something specific. She wanted it to say that she had all the time in the world, and none of it belonged to them. The heavy-set man saw her coming when she was still 30 yards out and said something to the younger one that made him look up. Neither of them moved from where they were. This was telling. Men on authorized business who see a landowner approaching generally stop what they are doing and come forward. Men on unauthorized business hold their ground and wait to see how much the landowner knows. She stopped 6 feet from them. She looked at the transit. She looked at the measuring rod. She looked at the heavy-set man. "This is private land," she said. "Past that pine is county survey, but you're on the creek bank side of it, which is mine." She paused. "I'll need to see your permit from the county land office." The heavy-set man put his hands in his coat pockets. He had a face made for patience, the wide, settled face of a man who expected resistance and had planned for it. "We're conducting a preliminary survey, ma'am. Authorized by the Territorial Development Office. No individual landowner notification required at the preliminary stage. I'd still like to see the paperwork. The paperwork is on file at the county seat. You're welcome to ride over and confirm. Cartwright is 30 miles, she said. You're here now, the paperwork should be with you." The younger man shifted his weight. The heavy-set man looked at her with the patient, practiced look of someone who had been in this conversation before and knew how it ended. "Ma'am, we'll be out of your way by sundown. No damage to your property. This is a standard procedure. It's a standard procedure to conduct a creek survey on private land without the landowner's knowledge or documented authorization." He smiled. It was a professionally pleasant smile, the smile of a man who had been trained to smile when he was not going to answer a question. "We appreciate your patience, ma'am." She looked at the transit. She looked at where it was pointed, which was downstream toward the narrowest section of the creek where the banks were closest and the water ran deepest. The section directly adjacent to the property marker her grandfather's men had set with a stone post in 1863. She looked at the measuring rod and where the younger man was holding it, which was at the water's edge, at the bank. She understood exactly what they were measuring and why. "I want you off my land," she said. "Both of you now." The heavy-set man looked at her for a moment, then he looked at the transit. Then he said, with the tone of a man doing her a favor by explaining, "We'll be done in approximately 2 hours. If you'd like to go back to your house, we won't disturb you." She said nothing. She stood where she was. She did not move, and she did not look away, and she let the silence tell them what she was not going to do, which was leave. She stood there for 4 minutes by her own internal count, perfectly still in the wind, and she looked at the heavy-set man, and he looked at his transit, and at the younger man, and at the sky, and at his boots, and after 4 minutes of this, he cleared his throat and said they'd come back another time, and the younger man began collapsing the measuring rod, and they gathered their equipment and walked back across the creek, at the flat stones, and up the far bank, and out of sight into the cottonwoods. She stayed where she was until she could no longer hear them. Then she turned and walked back to the house. That evening, after supper, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter. She was precise about this, the way she was precise about everything that mattered. She addressed it to the General Land Office in Cheyenne, the federal office that maintained original survey records for the territory, and she requested a certified copy of the original boundary survey for her property, including the water rights notation from the 1863 founding survey. She gave the legal description from her deed, which she had memorized the same winter Thomas died, because knowing the legal description of the thing you owned felt important when you were suddenly the only person responsible for keeping it. She folded the letter and sealed it and set it on the shelf by the door where she kept things that needed to go to town. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went back to the red flannel and the third shirt's collar pieces and did not think about the surveyors again that night. Not because she wasn't thinking about them, but because thinking about them while cutting a collar was a way to cut the collar wrong. Silas Thorn came on Saturday. This was not technically scheduled. The contract for the shirts had not included provisions for his personal appearances. She was aware of this and had been aware it was an open question, whether the contract was the whole of the arrangement, or whether it was the beginning of something that had not yet been fully defined. She was a woman who preferred things fully defined, which was why she had not answered that question, and had been watching to see what the answer would tell her about him. He brought his own horse this time, not the wagon, and he tied it at the gate, and came up the path at the measured pace of a man who had somewhere to be, but was not in a hurry about it. He knocked the way Hank had knocked, with the same single-knuckle respect for thresholds. When she opened the door, he had his hat in his hand, which struck her as a detail about him. The way he took his hat off consistently and immediately at a door, which was either habit or consideration, and in men of his size and standing was usually habit, except that it had the quality of consideration about it. She let him in. She offered coffee. He accepted without making the accepting into a social performance, which she appreciated, because men who made accepting a cup of coffee into a performance were men who needed too much acknowledgement for ordinary things. He sat at the kitchen table. She poured. He looked around the kitchen with the unhurried attention of a man who read rooms, because rooms told him things he needed to know. And she let him look because there was nothing in her kitchen she was ashamed of and nothing she was hiding, except the letter on the shelf by the door, which was not hidden exactly, but which she was not yet ready to discuss. The first shirt was on the form she used for fittings, a shaped linen stuffed form that had belonged to her mother and represented the average measurements of a man of middling build, which was to say, it looked nothing like the measurements she'd been given, but served as a starting structure. The collar was standing, high and neat, exactly as specified. He looked at it. He stood up and went to it, and turned it on the form and looked at the collar from the side and then the back. He did not touch it without asking, which surprised her. He asked if he could. She said yes. He turned the collar point between his thumb and forefinger, checking the stiffness of the interfacing, checking the seam allowance at the stand. That's right, he said, which was not a compliment exactly. It was an assessment, but it landed differently than a compliment would have. A compliment was an evaluation of quality. That's right meant she had understood what he needed and done it. She said she would have 2 ready for fitting by Wednesday if he could send Hank by. He said Hank could come. He sat back down. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup in the way of a man who didn't drink coffee so much as hold it for warmth while he thought. She sat across from him. The table between them was narrow, the kitchen-sized table of a farmhouse that had been built for efficiency rather than entertaining. And across that narrow table the width of him was more evident than it was outdoors where there was sky to measure him against. He was not merely large. He was large in the specific way of a man who had always been large and had made a kind of quiet peace with it, the way very tall trees made peace with being tall, by not making unnecessary movements and by being very deliberate about the space they occupied. He asked about the surveyors. She went still for a moment. Then she asked how he knew about the surveyors. He said Hank had seen tracks near the creek line on Thursday afternoon, 2 sets, and had followed them back to the road and found where a horse and wagon had been tied for several hours, and the wheel width and the shod horse pattern matched the rail survey crew camped east of Ridgeline. He had put that information together with the conversation he'd had with Dodd at the bank, and what he knew about where the rail line was being planned. She looked at him across the narrow table. She asked what he knew about where the rail line was planned. He put the coffee down. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, without preamble or softening. There are 2 routes through the valley. The original surveyed route goes north of the ridge, adds 11 miles and a significant grade through the canyon. The second route comes straight through the valley floor, shorter by 11 miles, flat grade all the way, which means lower fuel consumption and faster schedule. He paused. The second route crosses your creek. She said nothing. A steam locomotive, he continued, needs water approximately every 15 miles of continuous operation. The route through the valley has one reliable water source between the Eastern Junction and Harlan's Crossing. That source is your creek. She looked at the letter on the shelf by the door. He followed her gaze to it. He did not ask. I've requested the original boundary survey from Cheyenne, she said. The 1863 documentation with the water rights notation. Something in his expression shifted, not visibly, not in a way that another person might have caught, but she was watching carefully. What shifted was not surprise, but something like it in reverse, the opposite of surprise, the look of a person whose assessment of a situation has just been confirmed in a way that is useful, but also somehow more serious than it was before. That's the right thing to do, he said. She asked why he was telling her this. About the rail route. About the creek. He could have not told her. He could have let her find out on her own, or not at all. He had no obligation to her beyond the shirt contract, which was a recent and professional arrangement with no clauses relating to the disclosure of territorial rail surveying plans. He looked at the table for a moment. Then at her he said, "Because you deserve to know what you're holding before someone tries to take it from you." The wind came down the chimney and made the lamp flicker. She looked at the flame until it steadied. She asked what Dodd had to do with the rail route. She already had a shape of the answer in her mind, but she wanted to hear him draw it, wanted to see if the shape he drew matched hers, which would tell her something about whether she was reasoning clearly or whether fear had gotten into the calculation. He told her. 3 farms along the valley floor had been foreclosed in the past 4 years through the Harlan's Crossing Bank. All 3 had carried loans with penalty structures similar to what he'd seen in the Hale ledger. All 3 had been purchased at foreclosure price by a land-holding entity registered in the county seat. He had looked up the registration of that entity that week. The signatory was a man named Gideon Cross, who was Fletcher Dodd's brother-in-law. She set her coffee down with more force than she intended. The sound was sharp in the quiet kitchen. She said, "He's been doing this for 4 years. He said yes," she said, "and he wanted my land because of the creek." He said, "Your land is the keystone. Without the water access, the valley route has no fueling point. Without the valley route, the rail company has to take the Northern Canyon route, which adds cost and time and makes the whole line less profitable. Your 40 acres of creek bank are worth more to the right buyer than the rest of the valley combined." She stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking out at the creek line visible past the bare cottonwoods, the dark water catching what gray light the sky was giving. She was not crying. She was thinking. But they looked similar from the outside, and she was aware of this and was glad he did not say anything while she stood there. She asked, "Who is the right buyer?" He was quiet for a moment. When she turned around, his expression was the one she was beginning to recognize as the one he used when he was deciding how much to say, and had decided to say all of it. "The rail company has been in correspondence with me," he said, "about the valley route, about the water access question." She looked at him. He looked back. She waited. "I have an investment in the Western Rail Company," he said. "A significant one." She sat back down. Slowly, she put both her hands flat on the table and she looked at them. Then she looked at him, she said, with the particular quiet of a woman whose mind was moving faster than her voice. "How significant?" He said, controlling interest. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a gust came through, and the cottonwoods knocked their bare branches together with the dry, hollow sound of winter wood, and the lamp flame bent and steadied. She looked at him for a long time. He sat across the narrow table from her and let her look, which was itself a thing worth noting, that he did not fidget or fill the silence or manage her reaction, just let it be what it was going to be. She said, "Dodd has been trying to buy my land to sell it to you." He said, "Yes," she said, "and you're the one who told me about the surveyors." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" Not a question exactly. A statement of something she was still working out. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup again. He said, "Because what Dodd is doing to your loan account and what his hired men were doing at your creek bank are connected, and you can't defend against a thing you can't see clearly. He paused, and because the land is yours, not his, not mine, the creek is yours. I want to use it, but I want to pay you for it, not steal it from you through a man with a ledger and a pen. She sat with that. She sat with it the way she sat with fabric, before she cut it, turning it and examining it in every available light, looking for flaws in the weave, for places where the thread count dropped or the color ran inconsistent. She was looking for the place where his account of himself didn't hold. She couldn't find it. This did not mean it wasn't there. It meant she hadn't found it yet, which was different. She said, "I need to think." He said, "Of course." She said, "The shirts will be ready." He said, "I know they will." He stood up. He put his hat on. He went to the door and then stopped, his hand on the door frame. And he turned back halfway and he said, not looking directly at her, looking at the middle distance the way a man looked when he was going to say something he had not entirely planned. "My wife's name was Margaret. She died in February of 1879. The baby too. 3 days after." He paused. "I've had 11 head of cattle die in blizzards that I took harder than I took some human losses in my life. But Margaret and the baby." He stopped. Started again. "I am telling you that because you told me about your grandfather without being asked, and it seemed unfair to let you tell me something true about yourself without offering something in return." She said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be smaller than what he had just done. He said good afternoon and went out into the cold. She sat at the kitchen table, after the sound of his horse had faded, and she looked at the shirt on the fitting form and at the collar standing high and neat, and she thought about a man who had gotten particular about collar seams because a good young man had died cold on account of a split seam and had kept that particularity for 11 years. She thought about what kind of attention to the world that required. What kind of continuous care? She thought about the letter on the shelf by the door. The following Tuesday, Miles Corbett was restocking his spice shelf when Nora came in for thread. She needed black thread and a card of bone buttons for the 4th shirt, which required a slightly different button because one of the cowboys had a barrel chest that was going to require a different spacing on the front placket. Miles found the thread and the buttons and was ringing them up when he became expansive in the ways. He became expansive when he had been holding information he wasn't sure he was supposed to have, and the pressure of it was getting uncomfortable. He said, while counting her change with careful attention to the coins, as if they required his full concentration. "Good thing about that bank business, though. At least you don't have to worry about Dodd holding that loan over your head anymore." She went still. She looked at him. He became very focused on the coins. She said, "What bank business, Miles?" He said to the coins, "Well, the loan. Being settled up." He looked up. The look of a man who had just understood he had said a thing he was not supposed to say, which was confirmed by the expression on Nora Hale's face, which was the expression of a woman receiving information she did not previously have and was not going to receive gracefully. "I thought you. He came in and I assumed you knew," she said. "Silas Thorn paid my loan." Miles set the change down on the counter. He said that perhaps he had misunderstood the situation. He said this with the conviction of a man who understood the situation perfectly and would very much prefer not to have mentioned it. She picked up her thread and her buttons. She left the change where it was. She said, with the precise quietness that was not quiet at all, "How long ago?" Miles said it had been the same day he bought the flannel. The same morning. She walked out of the mercantile. She was halfway home before she stopped walking and stood in the road with her thread and her buttons in her coat pocket and her hands at her sides, and she breathed for a moment in the cold, and she put together what she knew. He had walked into the bank on the same morning he bought the flannel. The same morning he loaded it into his wagon and caught up with her on the creek road and offered her work at fair wages, which was a real offer and a fair offer, and also an offer made by a man who had that morning paid off her debt without telling her. He had not told her when he offered her the contract. He had not told her when he came on Saturday and sat at her kitchen table and told her about the surveyors and the rail route and the controlling interest. He had sat across that narrow table and told her a great deal and not told her this. She started walking again. Faster. She understood by the time she reached her gate that she was angry. She understood that the anger was not entirely simple. It was made of several things, the way most real anger was. There was the anger of a woman who had been decided about, without being asked, which was a familiar kind of anger she had spent her adult life navigating with varying success. There was underneath it a smaller and more complicated thing, which was that the decision he had made on her behalf was a good one. It had removed a real and immediate threat, and that made the anger more complicated rather than less, because gratitude and anger pointed in different directions, and being pulled both ways at once was uncomfortable. She changed into her work clothes and mucked the stalls and split the afternoon's firewood, and by the time she had done these things, the anger had settled from the first hot stage into something more workable, something she could reason with. She thought about what he had said on Saturday. The land is yours, not his, not mine. I want to pay you for it, not steal it from you. She thought about a man who said one and did another, which was paying her debt without asking, which was the same category of decision as stealing something except in the opposite direction, except it had cost him money rather than cost her anything, except that it had cost her something she had not had a name for until she was standing in the creek road thinking about it. It had cost her the decision. He had made a decision that was hers to make and had made it before she knew it existed. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about it while she made her supper, and while she ate it, and while she washed the single plate and the single cup and the single fork, and by the time she sat down at the table with the red flannel and the fourth shirt's pattern pieces, she had decided what she was going to do. On Wednesday morning she saddled her horse, the aging bay who was careful on hard ground, and she rode the 2 miles to town, and then the additional half-mile past town along the north road that led to the Rimrock Ranch turnoff. The Rimrock Ranch gate was a substantial piece of work. 2 uprights of peeled lodgepole with a crossbar, and on the crossbar the ranch name burnt into the wood in letters an inch deep, the permanence of a man who had intended to stay. The road from the gate to the house was a 1/4 mile of graded gravel, which was not common in the territory, and represented a specific decision about what was worth spending money on. Functional things, lasting things. The house itself was large and plainly made. 2 stories, board and batten siding, deep covered porch running the full width of the front, 4 windows on the ground floor, evenly spaced, no decorative trim, no shutters, no evidence of the kind of prosperity that announces itself. The only indication that this was not an ordinary ranch house was the scale of it. The scale and the quality of the materials, the tight seams of the siding, the solid weight of the porch columns. Hank Deaver was in the yard near the barn when she rode in. He looked at her horse, and then at her, and then at his hat brim, and he said that the boss was in the barn checking on a mare who'd thrown a shoe. She found him crouched beside the mare's left rear leg in the second stall, his big hands moving carefully along the hoof wall, while one of the younger cowboys held the mare's head. He had his back to the door when she came in and didn't turn, because the quality of sound a person made in a barn told you what you needed to know before you looked up. He said without turning, "Hank said you rode in." He finished what he was doing with the hoof, told the cowboy to keep her quiet for another hour, and stood up. He turned around. He looked at her face, and something in his own face settled into the look of a man who has been waiting for a particular conversation, and has decided that when it comes, he is going to stand still and take it. She said, "Miles Corbett told me about the loan." He said, "I expected he would eventually." She said, "You should have told me yourself." He said, "Yes." She said, "That day on the wagon, in my kitchen on Saturday. You had 2 opportunities and you chose not to." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The mare shifted behind him. He said, "Because I knew you would object before I could explain the reason for it, and I was not sure I could explain it in a way that you would accept." She said, "Try now." He looked at her across the width of the stall aisle, across the barn-smelling cold air with its overlay of horse and hay, and the particular clean smell of cold wood. Tempt. He said Dodd was adding false penalties to force a default. You were not behind on your loan. You were behind on his manufactured version of your loan. The amount he had built up through those penalties was $430, but the amount you actually owed, the amount you agreed to and your husband agreed to, was the original 200 plus legitimate interest, which by my calculation was closer to 240. He paused. I paid the number in the ledger, because the ledger was what he would take to the county court if you defaulted, and the county court would not care about the difference between the number and what was just. She said, "That was my decision to make." He said, "It was." He did not argue with it. He said it back to her flatly. "The way you repeated a thing you agreed with and were not going to qualify. It was your decision and I made it. That was wrong. I am not going to tell you it wasn't," she said, "but you'd do it again." A pause. The honest pause of a man who had examined this question before she asked it, and had found the honest answer, which was not the convenient one. He said, "If it meant keeping you from losing that farm to a man who manufactured reasons to take it, yes, I would do it again, and I would tell you sooner." She stood in the aisle, with her hands in her coat pockets, and she looked at him, and he stood and let her look. He had the quality which she was coming to understand, was a fixed characteristic rather than a situational one, of a man who did not need to manage how he appeared. He looked the same whether he thought she was judging him favorably or unfavorably, which was either the confidence of a man with nothing to prove or the indifference of a man who did not particularly care what she thought. She was fairly certain it was the first one. She was not yet fully certain. She said, "I'm going to pay you back. Every dollar." He said, "I know you are." She said, "Don't agree with me just to end the argument." He said, "I'm not. I'm agreeing with you because I watched you walk out of a store in the cold, with 2 miles of frozen road in front of you, and not one change in your stride, and a woman like that pays her debts." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said that she would need his measurements. His actual measurements, not the number on Hank's list. For the 15th shirt. He said the number on Hank's list was accurate. She said she wanted to verify it herself, because she did not cut fabric based on numbers given to her secondhand. She cut it based on what she measured. He said the number was 48. She said she heard him the first time. She took her measuring tape from her coat pocket, where she had put it that morning when she left the house, not because she had planned to do this, but because she always carried it, and she stepped forward and he stood still. She measured his chest, 49. She measured his shoulder span, 22. She measured his sleeve from the shoulder seam point to his wrist, 35. She wrote each number in the small notebook she kept in her other pocket, and she noted at the bottom of the page, because she was precise about everything that mattered. Measurements taken directly, December 1883. She put the tape away. She said she would have his shirt ready last, because a man who commissioned the work should not expect it first. He said, "That seems fair." She went out of the barn and found her horse and rode home. That evening she did not think about the measuring tape, or the 49 inches, or the way he had stood entirely still while she worked, the way large men only stood still when they had learned to be careful of themselves. She did not think about these things because there was work to do, and she was a woman who did the work in front of her and did not spend time on things that were not yet determined. She thought instead about Fletcher Dodd, about the 3 farms, about the entity in the county seat registered to his brother-in-law, about the surveyors at her creek bank, about the way Dodd had smiled in the bank and said, "Many things can happen between now and the first of the year." She thought about what he would do next, now that the loan leverage was gone. She realized, thinking the way you thought about an opponent, not a difficult customer, not a disappointing institution, an opponent, a man who wanted something she had and was willing to break things to get it. She cut the evening's work into the flannel with her shears, clean and certain, the way you cut when you had decided where the line was going to go and were not going to move it. The shirts were taking shape the way good work always took shape. Not quickly, not with any drama about it. One at a time, each one a small, complete argument for attention and care, the collars standing exactly as specified, the seams lying flat inside the sleeves, where no one would see them except the man wearing the shirt and the woman who had put them there. Nora finished the 7th shirt on a Wednesday evening and held it up in the lamplight and turned it once, checking the fall of the collar points, running her thumb along the inside cuff, where the stitching had to sit flat enough to live comfortably under a glove all day. It was right. She hung it with the others on the row of pegs she had cleared along the north wall for this purpose, and she blew out the extra lamp and went to the window before she went to bed. The creek was visible past the cottonwoods, catching what little moonlight the clouds allowed, a dark moving line in the dark. The boundary marker was a shadow at the bank's edge. Still there. She looked at it the way she had been looking at it every night since the surveyors, the way you looked at something you were responsible for keeping, and that someone else was trying to take, which was not with fear, but with the steady inventory of a woman who checked her fences. She went to bed. She lay in the cold and she thought about Fletcher Dodd, which she had been doing with increasing regularity since the bank meeting. Not obsessively, but precisely, the way you thought about weather that was building. He had the loan mechanism, and it was gone. He had the surveyors and she had faced them down. He was not a man who stopped. She knew this without needing evidence because she knew the type. Men who had built their security on the assumption that other people would eventually give way, and who could not compute a different outcome because they had never had to, she thought. He has something else, she thought. Find it before it finds you. In the morning she split wood for an hour before the temperature had committed fully to the day, the axe falling in the clean rhythm of work that asked everything from the body and gave back clarity, and she thought while she worked about what she knew and what she didn't and what the gap between them might contain. The second week of December, Silas came on a Tuesday. Not scheduled. The contract did not schedule his visits. She had noticed that his appearances followed no pattern she could predict in advance and always a pattern she could understand in retrospect, which was that he came when something needed to be said and had settled enough in him to be said clearly. She had come to read this as a form of respect, the refusal to fill her time with words that weren't ready yet. He knocked, and she let him in, and she poured coffee without asking, because that was what you did by the fourth visit, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of performance. He sat at the table. She sat across from him. The lamp between them threw its steady circle, and outside the wind was doing its December work on the cottonwoods. He asked about the surveyors, whether she had seen them again. She said no, not since the afternoon she had walked out and asked for their permits. He nodded. He said Hank had tracked the wheel pattern of their wagon back to the road, and then to a livery in town that did occasional contract work for outside parties. He said the livery owner, when asked directly, had said the men had been hired through a written arrangement, payment in advance, no name on the agreement but a bank draft from the Harlan's Crossing Bank. She set her cup down. She said, "That's Dodd." He said, "That's Dodd." She said, "He hired them himself. Not through a third party," he said, "which means he was in a hurry. A man who uses intermediaries when he has time didn't use one here." She thought about that. She thought about what created urgency in a man like Dodd, who had been patient enough to build a 4-year scheme. She said, "There's a deadline," he said. "The rail survey closes January 15th. That's when the company finalizes the route. After that, the land acquisition parameters are fixed and no private arrangement can change them." She said, "He's known about the deadline since September." He said, "Since the county board meeting?" "Yes," she said. "So he has been counting on moving me off this property before January, and when the loan penalties weren't moving fast enough, he sent surveyors." He said, "Yes," she said, "and now the surveyors didn't work either." He said, "Yes." She said, "What does he do next?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who didn't know. The quiet of a man who knew and was deciding whether what he knew was his to say or hers to discover. She watched him make that decision and was glad when he said, "He has options. The assessor's office. A petition to the county board on grounds of public necessity, or something more direct." She said, "More direct," he said. "The boundary marker at the creek. If it moved, the water rights notation in the deed would become contestable. The creek would fall on the county survey side of the line." She looked at the window, at the dark outside it. She said, "Men with equipment in the dark," he said. "It's what I would prepare for if I were him," she said. "Are you preparing for it?" he said. "I have men on the Ridge Road 3 nights a week. Hank checks the tracks on the other nights." She looked at him across the table. He had been doing this without telling her, which was a thing she would address separately. The question of what he told her and when, but which right now was less important than what it meant, which was that he had been watching her land while she slept. She said, "How long?" He said, "Since the surveyors." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." He said, "It's not." She said, "I know what it is, and isn't. I'm thanking you for it." He received that without elaborating on it, which was correct. She stood up. She went to the window and she stood beside it rather than in front of it, a habit she had developed in the past 2 weeks without planning to, keeping the wall at her shoulder when she looked out. The marker was still there in the dark. The creek was still running. She said, without turning, "Tell me about the rail company." He was quiet behind her. She heard him set the cup down. She heard the table creak with the shift of his weight. She said, "Not the Rimrock Ranch. The other thing, the thing you haven't told me yet." The silence stretched. Not uncomfortable. The silence of a man arriving at a decision he had been approaching for some time. She turned around. He was looking at his hands on the table, those large road-worn hands, and then he looked up at her. He said, "I should have said this earlier," she said. "Say it now," he said. "The Western Rail Company. I'm not just an investor in the line." He paused. "I hold controlling interest. I am the primary shareholder. The route decisions, the land acquisition parameters, the timeline, those are mine to determine." She stood very still. She was doing the arithmetic in her head, and it was fast arithmetic. She had always been fast with numbers, and what the numbers said when they came out was something that reorganized the entire shape of what had been happening. She said, "Dodd has been buying land to sell to the rail company." He said, "Yes." She said, "For 4 years." He said, "The 3 foreclosed farms along the valley floor, all positioned along the route." She said, "He was going to sell them to you." He said, "He was going to try. He didn't know who I was in relation to the company. He knew I was a shareholder. He didn't know the extent of it." She looked at him. She looked at the table between them. She looked at the lamp and the circle it threw and the shirts hanging on the pegs along the wall, 15 of them in progress, the whole commission that had brought him to her door in November. She said, "He has been trying to steal my land, to sell it to you, without knowing you were the one he was selling to." He said, "Yes." She stood with that for a long moment. And then something happened that she had not anticipated, which was that the absurdity of it arrived before the anger did. The sheer crooked geometry of a man spending 4 years and a great deal of calculated cruelty to manufacture a transaction that was its own undoing. And she made a sound, not a laugh exactly, shorter than a laugh and made of the same thing. The involuntary sound of a person who has just seen the punchline of a joke they didn't know they were inside. He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved, and then he laughed too, which was not a performance but a response. The laugh of a man who had been carrying the irony of the situation alone for long enough that having someone else see it was a relief. It lasted only a moment. The anger came in behind it, as she knew it would, the real anger, the one that had been waiting beneath the arithmetic. She said, "He was counting on me not knowing what I had." He said, "Yes." She said, "The creek. He wanted it because of the water access for the locomotives." He said, "Your creek runs volume year-round. There are 3 other sources within 15 miles of the station point. 2 dry in late summer. 1 drops to levels that won't serve the engines in drought years. Your water is the only reliable source for the valley route," she said, "and without the valley route," he said, "the Northern Canyon route. 11 miles longer, significant grade through the canyon. Higher fuel cost, slower schedule, the whole line less profitable." She said, "So my 40 acres are the keystone." He said, "The creek that runs through your 40 acres. "Yes." She looked at the window again. She looked at the dark outside it. She thought about Thomas taking the loan in 1,879 to buy seed and repair the barn wall, the ordinary necessary decision of an ordinary year. And she thought about what had been growing around that decision ever since, the penalties building in the ledger while Thomas was still alive, before he was sick, before anyone would have known to watch for it. She thought about the specific patience of a man who had started planning before she even knew there was something to plan against. She said, "He started before Thomas died," he said. "The loan terms were altered within 8 months of the original signing, before Thomas was sick." She sat down. Slowly, she put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. This was not grief exactly. It was the specific weight of understanding something about the years she had already lived through, the retroactive revelation that they had been harder than they needed to be, shaped by a scheme she hadn't known existed. She breathed once, deliberately, and let the weight settle where it needed to settle. He said nothing. He did not fill the silence or manage it. He simply remained present on the other side of the table, which was what the moment required. And he understood that, which told her something more about him than anything he had said. She said, when she was ready, "What do you want from the creek?" He said, "A water access easement. Pipe from the creek to the station. 10 years, fixed payment, you retain full ownership and all other use rights." He paused. $600 a year. She looked at him. She said, "You've drafted this already." He said, "I have a document. I would like you to read it. You don't have to sign anything tonight. You don't have to sign anything at all." She said, $600 a year for 10 years. He said, "Yes." She said, "That's $6,000. He said, "Yes." She said, "Quarterly payments." He said, "The document says annual." "I'll change it to quarterly," she said, "and I want inspection rights for the installation. If the pipe affects my pasture drainage, I can require modification." He said, "Done." She said, "And 12 months notice for termination, not 6. He said, "Done." She said, "You're agreeing very quickly," he said. "They're reasonable requests," she said. "You had already thought of them." He said, "I had. I wanted to see which ones you would think of." She looked at him across the table. She said, "That is a very strange way to negotiate." He said, "I wasn't negotiating. I was learning how you think." She was quiet for a moment then. "And what did you learn?" He said, "That you think the way you sow. From the inside out. You start with what has to be right where no one can see it, and the visible part follows from that." She looked at the shirts on the wall. She looked at the lamp. She looked at her hands on the table. She said, "Bring me the document. I'll read it tonight and tell you tomorrow what else needs changing." He said he would have it to her in the morning. He stood. He picked up his hat. He was at the door when she said, "Silas." He turned. She said, "The thing you should have told me earlier, about the rail company." She paused. "Tell me things like that when you know them, not when you've decided I'm ready." He held her gaze. He said, "Yes, you're right." He said it the way he said things he fully meant, without softening and without the impulse to explain further. He put his hat on and went out. She sat at the table after the sound of his horse had gone, and she looked at the shirts on the wall, and she thought about what $600 a year meant in the arithmetic of her life. It meant the porch repaired properly, not patched. It meant new fence wire for the whole east line. It meant the horse reshod on a schedule rather than when she could manage it. It meant Dodd's leverage reduced to nothing, because you could not manufacture financial pressure against a woman whose income was contractually secured for a decade. She went to the sewing box for a bobbin, and when she moved the tray aside, she found it. A scrap of gray wool, the kind of gray that creek water went in January, the hem piece from the dress she had worn out and finally cut apart for rags 2 winters ago. Thomas had bought the wool the year they were married. She had made the dress herself and worn it until there was nothing left to wear. The scrap was small, maybe 3 inches, with the careful close stitching of a repair she had done at the side seam when the dress was still worth repairing. Black thread because she had run out of gray. She held it for a moment. This was what poverty looked like from the inside. Not the dress that other people saw and judged, the worn hem and the twice-let seam. The black thread on gray because you used what you had. The repair so careful you had to know where to look to find it. She set the scrap on the shelf, above the sewing box, beside the wooden box with the colonel's medal and his land grant parchment, because it belonged with the things that were true and should be remembered. Then she threaded her needle and went back to work. 2 days later, Clara Dodd rode up the south road on her bay mare. Nora saw her coming from the kitchen window, with enough time to understand that whatever was bringing Clara Dodd to her door in December had been building for a while, because a woman like Clara did not make this kind of ride on impulse. She had thought about it first, probably for several days. The thinking showed in how she rode, the upright, deliberate posture of a woman who had made a decision and was executing it before she could change her mind. Nora put on her coat and went to the door, and opened it before Clara reached the porch steps, because she preferred to manage the geometry herself, and she stood in the doorway and waited. Clara dismounted. She tied the mare to the porch post with a neat, efficient knot, the knot of a woman who had handled horses since girlhood and didn't think about it. She came to the bottom of the steps, and she looked up at Nora, and she did not begin with the social opening that women in her position usually began with, the pleasantry about the weather or the comment about the road. She said, "I know what my husband has been doing." Nora said, "All of it, or recently." Clara's expression did not shift. She said, "The loan penalties. The surveyors. I didn't know about the surveyors until last week, when I found the correspondence." She paused. "I want you to know that I am not my husband." Nora looked at her. She was reading her the way she read everything that required careful understanding, looking for the place where the account of itself didn't hold. Clara Dodd was 51 years old, and had spent those years in a position that had not required her to account for herself to anyone below her station. And this showed in certain habits of posture and expression that were deep enough to be structural. But underneath the structure was something else. Something tight around the eyes that was not the usual tightness of social performance. Nora said, "Why are you here?" Clara said, "Because this valley is not large enough to contain a woman who has done what I have done and not account for it." Nora said, "You mean the mercantile?" Clara said, "I mean everything I have said and not said and laughed at and looked away from for a long time. The mercantile is the most recent instance." Nora stood with that. She understood now the fuller shape of what had brought Clara here, which was not simple conscience. Conscience alone did not make a woman ride 2 miles in December. What had brought her was the combination of conscience and calculation, the dawning understanding that her husband's scheme was going to fail, that failure was going to be public, and that a woman who had aligned herself with cruelty was going to be standing in the light of that failure, holding the cruelty she had chosen. Clara was not purely selfless. She was also smart enough to read which way a situation was going and position herself accordingly. Both things were true simultaneously, and Nora found that more believable than either one alone. She said, "You don't know yet how this ends." Clara said, "I know how it's going to end. Fletcher made an enemy of a man who has more resources than he does and more patience, and he did it while thinking he had the advantage." She said it flatly, without theater. The assessment of a woman who had watched her husband operate for 26 years and knew exactly what he was and was not capable of. Nora said, "And you came here?" Clara said, "I came here because I was unkind to you in a store in November, and it was wrong. Not because you are poor, not because your dress was worn, because you are the granddaughter of the man who built this town, and you were standing there with your coins on the counter, and I chose to be the worst version of myself, and I have been thinking about it since." Nora looked at her for a long moment. She thought about what the colonel had believed, about the obligations of the strong toward the weak, which was not sentimentality but practicality, the understanding that a community was only as coherent as its least powerful member's ability to stand in it. She thought about what it cost Clara to be standing on these steps right now, in the cold without the armor of her usual social position protecting her. She said, "I appreciate you coming." She meant it precisely as much as she said it, not more and not less. It was not forgiveness, it was not the closing of anything. It was acknowledgement that a person had done a hard thing and the hard thing had been noted. Clara seemed to understand this, because her expression did not soften into relief the way it would have if she had expected absolution. Clara said, "There is something else." Nora waited. Clara said, "Fletcher had a letter last week from the county assessor's office. He initiated a property reassessment request for your parcel. If the assessment raises your tax valuation to reflect the creek's strategic value for the rail development, your annual tax burden would be unmanageable." She paused. "He filed it 3 days ago." Nora felt the cold of the air differently for a moment, the cold of understanding arriving where warmth had been. This was the thing she had known was coming, the shape she had been trying to find in the dark. Not surveyors with equipment. Something cleaner. Paper. The same instrument he had used on the loan, the bureaucratic lever that worked slowly and was hard to fight because it was technically legitimate. She said, "When does the assessor act on it?" Clara said, "He'll contact you to schedule a review. It will look routine." Nora said, "And if the valuation goes up?" Clara said, "Fletcher controls 2 of the 3 people on the assessment review panel through his bank relationships." Nora said, "He told you this?" Clara said, "He told the wall behind his desk while I was sitting on the other side of the door." Nora looked at the woman on her porch steps, and she thought that a marriage of 26 years produced a particular kind of knowing. The way living in a house long enough meant you knew which boards were soft before you stepped on them. Clara had been learning the soft boards for 2.5 decades. She said, "Thank you for telling me." Clara untied her mare. She mounted with the same efficient ease she had dismounted with. She looked down at Nora from the saddle and she said, "I cannot undo what my husband has done. I am also not willing to be standing beside him when it comes apart." She said it clearly, without apology for the clarity. Then she turned the horse and rode back north, toward town. Nora stood on the porch until the sound of hooves had faded. Then she went inside. She went directly to the shelf above the sewing box, and she took down the deed box and she opened it and she looked at what was inside. The land grant, the water rights certification, the letter from the General Land Office in Cheyenne that had arrived 2 days ago, which she had read 4 times, and which now felt more important than it had when it arrived. She had sent her request to the General Land Office 3 weeks ago, the certified copy of the original 1,863 boundaries survey for her section, with the water rights notation, written in the formal hand of a federal surveyor who had done his work 60 years before anyone knew a railroad was coming through this valley. The notation was in federal language, the language that did not bend for county assessment panels or bank managers with network relationships. It said what it said, and it had said it since 1,863, and it would say it after everyone currently arguing about it was dead. She thought about the assessor's review. She thought about Dodd's 2 relationships on the panel. She thought about what a registered commercial easement agreement with the rail company would do to the assessment argument, which was that it would make the argument substantially harder to sustain because the property's value as a water source would already be spoken for under contract, fixed and documented, and an assessor could not argue for an upward revaluation of a use that was already under a fixed-term federal commercial agreement. She thought, "I need to sign the contract before the assessor schedules his review." She put on her coat. She went out and saddled the bay horse, who was patient about being saddled even in cold weather, because he had been treated well for a long time and had associated the process with outcomes that were acceptable. She rode to Rimrock Ranch. Hank was in the yard near the water trough when she rode in, chipping ice from the trough's surface with the handle of a hatchet, and he looked at her arrival with the expression of a man who had been expecting something and was uncertain whether this was it. He told her the boss was in the office. She thanked him and went in through the side door he indicated. The office was a room she had not been in before, at the back of the house, with a wood-burning stove throwing good heat, and a desk that was buried under papers in the organized way of a man who knew where everything was, but had accumulated too much to make it look like it. One wall was a map of the territory, hand-drawn in several colors, with pencil lines she recognized as the rail survey routes. She found the valley route with her eyes, and she followed it to where it crossed her creek, and she looked at that point on the map for a moment. Silas stood up from the desk when she came in. He had a pen in his hand, and the look of a man pulled out of calculation. He took in that she had ridden here, and he read something in the manner of it. He said, without preamble, "What happened?" She told him about the assessor, about Clara's visit, about the 2-panel relationships. She told it quickly and clearly, the way she told everything that required decision, and she watched his expression while she talked, and what she saw was not surprise, but the crystallization of something he had been waiting to see take its final form. He said, "He's accelerating." She said, "He's running out of time and he knows it." He said, "The assessment request is slower than he needs it to be. He's buying himself a mechanism in case the direct approach doesn't work." She said, "What's the direct approach?" He said, "The boundary marker. He hasn't given up on it. The assessment is insurance." She said, "Then I need to sign the contract before either mechanism gets further." He looked at her. He said, "You've read it." She said, "I've read it 4 times. I have 2 remaining questions." He said, "Ask them." She said, "The termination clause allows the company to terminate with 12 months' notice. Does that include any circumstance under which the company's ownership changes?" He said, "It should. I'll have Foster add a change of ownership protection clause. If the company is sold or transferred, your agreement terms survive the transfer." she said. Good. Second question. The inspection rights clause says I can require modification if the installation affects pasture drainage. Does that extend to the water quality of the return flow from the station? He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as the one he used when she had said something that he had not expected and that he was genuinely interested in. He said, That's not in the current draft. She said, It should be. If the station operation affects what goes back into the creek, that affects my water and my livestock. He said, Yes, it should be. He wrote something on the page in front of him. He said, I'll have Foster draft the full language today. Can you come back tomorrow morning? She said, I'll come back tomorrow morning. She rode home in the late afternoon, the light flat and gray from the cloud cover that had been building since noon, and she thought about Dodd's two-panel relationships, and about the timeline, and about what it meant to have spent 3 years managing alone, and to now be in a situation where managing alone was not the only option, where there was someone who also had something at stake and who was, she had decided, trustworthy enough to stand beside. Not trustworthy in the uncomplicated sense she had not arrived at uncomplicated trust, and was not sure she was constructed for it, but trustworthy in the sense that mattered, which was that his interest and hers were aligned in the specific way that made deception expensive for him rather than cheap, and that he had demonstrated across 6 weeks of specific circumstances, that when the cost of honesty was high he paid it anyway. That was enough. Enough to sign a contract, enough to build on. She went inside and she built up the fire, and she made her supper, and she went to bed at a reasonable hour. She did not lie awake. Not for long. In the morning she went to see Reverend Cole before she went to Rimrock Ranch. She had not planned this in advance. She had been thinking in the hour before dawn when she moved from sleep into the day's first accounting about what she needed that was not in a contract, not in federal documentation, not in a registered agreement. She needed a witness who was not her and not Silas and not a lawyer, a witness who knew this valley and its people the way only a man who had tended them for 19 years could know, and who carried a kind of authority that was different from legal authority and in some communities more durable. The church was locked at that hour, but Reverend Cole's house was attached to the back of it, and he came to the door in his vest and shirt sleeves, with the unhurried expression of a man who had been awake for hours and was not surprised by early visitors, because people in genuine need came early, and he had learned not to distinguish between reasonable hours and necessary. He let her in. She sat at his kitchen table, which was smaller and more worn than the one in his office, the table of a man who lived simply behind the public face of his role. She told him everything. Not just the recent events, the whole shape of it, from the loan penalties to the surveyors, to the assessor, to Clara's visit. She told it as a complete account, the way you told something to someone who was going to hold it, because she wanted it held by someone whose holding of it would mean something in this community. He listened with the quality of listening she had noticed in him at services, the listening that came from someone who had spent 2 decades hearing what people actually meant beneath what they said, and who had learned to sit with the full weight of what was given him without deflecting it. When she finished, he said, "You're telling me because you want a witness." She said, "I'm telling you because the truth of what has been happening needs to live somewhere outside my deed box before the end of January. And because you know these people, you know Dodd, and you know the board members, and you know what kind of authority it takes to make something visible in this valley." He said, "And you want me at the bank when this comes to a head." She said, "I want you to know. Whether you come is your decision." He said, "I'll come." She nodded. She stood. She said, "One more thing." She reached into her coat pocket and she took out the small scrap of gray wool she had found in the sewing box 2 nights ago. She held it for a moment and then she put it back. She said, "My grandfather brought 61 families through 300 miles of open territory. He named this town because nobody else had a better idea. The town has been forgetting that for a while." Reverend Cole said, "Towns forget things that don't have anyone to remember them." She said, "Then I'll remember it." She went out into the cold morning and rode to Rimrock Ranch, and she signed the contract with Foster's revisions in place, both new clauses reading exactly as she had specified. And she took her copy and she put it in her coat pocket, beside where the gray wool scrap had been, and she rode back to town with the registered agreement going to the county clerk and the timeline now working for her rather than against her. 3 days. The document needed 3 days to be registered and on record. Dodd would learn about it. She was counting on him learning about it. A man who saw his last mechanism being foreclosed before his deadline made his most direct move, which was the move that created the most exposure. Direct moves in the dark left the most evidence, and evidence was what Judge Price would need. She got home in the late afternoon, and she stabled the horse, and she split the day's wood, and she went inside and built the fire, and sat at the table with the 14th shirt's pattern pieces and her shears. The cutting was clean. The shears moved through the red flannel with the authority of a woman who knew where the line was going to go and was not going to move it. Outside, the creek ran in the dark past the boundary marker that was still standing exactly where it had stood since 1863, and the night was cold and clear, and somewhere on the ridge road Hank Deaver had 2 men watching the tracks. She cut the collar pieces and she pinned them to the front band, and she looked at the small gray scrap on the shelf above the sewing box, visible at the edge of her lamplight, and she thought about what it was and wasn't. It was not the worst thing that had happened to her. It was the record of a year when the worst had happened, and she had continued anyway, had made the repair with black thread because the gray had run out, and had kept the dress until the dress was done, and had then made something else. That was what you did with the material you had. You worked it until it was finished, and then you made something else. Sunday came in clear and hard, the sky a blue so pale it was almost white, the kind of sky that offered light without warmth and made shadows sharp and short on the frozen ground. Nora rode to Harlan's Crossing for the morning service, the way she always rode to Harlan's Crossing for the morning service. On time, alone, with the contract folded inside her coat against her chest, where it had been since she put it there at 4th. That morning, when she got up and read it a 4th time, and decided she had read it enough times to know what she was going to do about it. She had not told anyone she was going to see Reverend Cole. There was nothing to tell yet. She was going to church the way she went every Sunday, and after the service she was going to speak with the minister about a matter of local record, and that was a thing that required no announcement. The church was a plain building, white-painted clapboard, the paint holding better than most buildings in the valley, because Reverend Cole applied a maintenance coat every spring without fail. He had been doing this for 19 years. The church was, as a result, the best maintained structure on the main street, which he considered a professional obligation rather than a point of pride, though it was both. She sat in her usual pew, 3rd from the front on the left, which had been her pew since Thomas was alive, and had remained hers in the uncomplicated territorial way of small congregations where everyone sat where they sat and the arrangement was not discussed or altered. Around her the usual assembly, the Pratt family, with their considerable number of children arranged by height along their bench, the Hendersons from the North Farm, old Hector Pell, who smelled of horses and coal smoke, and who sang the hymns with a vigorous inaccuracy that suggested he found the spirit more important than the pitch. Fletcher Dodd sat in his pew, 4th from the front on the right, his wife Clara beside him. He was wearing his best coat, which was a charcoal wool frock coat that he wore to church and to no other occasion visible to Nora, and he sat with the contained, proprietary posture of a man who considered his presence in a community institution a form of ownership rather than participation. He did not look at Nora. She noted this as information. A man who had done nothing he was aware of would have looked at her, the way he always looked at her, which was with the impersonal acknowledgement of a bank officer noting a customer. He did not look at her, which meant he knew she knew something, or suspected she did, or had been thinking about what she might know. Clara looked at her, once briefly, the look of a woman who had ridden to her house on a cold Tuesday, and said what she had said, and was now watching to see what Nora was going to do with it. Nora gave her nothing. Not coldness, not warmth, just the forward-facing attention of a woman who was there for the service. Reverend Cole gave his sermon on the subject of stewardship, which he had apparently chosen without knowledge of the specific irony involved, the care of things entrusted to you, the responsibility that came with holding something of value, the difference between possession and ownership in the moral sense. Nora listened to this with the particular attention of a person receiving information relevant to their immediate situation through a channel not intended for that purpose. She thought the colonel would have found it funny. She found it instructive. After the service, when the congregation had moved into the brief milling period in the churchyard that served as the valley's primary social exchange, Nora waited until Reverend Cole had accepted his compliment of handshakes and weather commentary and moved toward his office door at the side of the building before she approached him. He was a small man, Reverend Cole, who wore his smallness with the settled comfort of someone who had made a full accounting of himself and found it sufficient. His face was lined and alert, the face of a man who listened for a living and had become very good at it. He held the door for her without being asked, which meant he had been expecting her approach, which meant he had been watching for it, which meant he understood that she was not there for ordinary pastoral reasons. His office was small, heated by a cast iron stove, the shelves and walls exactly as she remembered them from her visit earlier that week. He was already standing when she came to the door, which told her he had been expecting her approach. She said, "The board meeting. It's going to be at the bank. Before the 15th, he said. I know. He had known since she had sat at his kitchen table before dawn 3 days ago and told him everything. He had been thinking about it since. I said I'd come. I meant it. She said I wanted you to hear it again, now that I've signed the contract and the registration is done. The situation has moved, he said. How far? She said, far enough that what happens Friday will be visible. The whole town will see it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, then the whole town should understand what they're seeing before they see it. He folded his hands on the desk. I'll be there. She stood. She said, Reverend Cole, the sermon this morning. He said, yes? She said, stewardship was a good choice. She meant it. He received it as meant. She went out. She was in the saddle, and halfway to the gate when she saw Hank Deaver on the main street, not on horseback, on foot, moving with the particular purposefulness of a man who had something specific to do, and was getting to it without detours. He saw her at the same moment. He changed direction. He came to her horse's head and looked up at her with the expression he used when the situation was serious and required him to be careful about how he delivered the serious thing. He said, you need to come to the ranch, Mrs. Hale. Boss sent me to find you, she said. What happened, he said. He'll tell you. But you need to come. She turned her horse and followed him. At the Rimrock Ranch, Silas was in the office with a man she did not recognize, a younger man in a town coat, who had the look of someone who had ridden hard from somewhere in the last 24 hours. The younger man was standing near the stove warming his hands, and the papers in front of Silas on the desk were covered in the same precise hand she recognized from rail company documents she had seen. Silas looked up when she came in. He said, Dodd sent a petition to the county board last Thursday. I received word this morning. He's requesting an emergency condemnation assessment of your property on grounds of public necessity for the rail development. She stood in the doorway and took that in. She said, he can do that, Silas said. He has standing to request it as a bank officer with a documented interest in valley development projects. The board can vote to authorize a formal assessment, which would freeze any private property transfers or agreement executions pending the assessment outcome. She said, including the easement contract. He said, including the easement contract. If the board votes to authorize the assessment, before you execute the contract can be challenged as an attempt to avoid public necessity proceedings. She said, when does the board meet? He said, next Friday. 5 days. She came into the room. She sat down. The younger man near the stove had the tactful quality of a man who understood he was present at a conversation he was not part of, and he kept his attention directed at the stove's general vicinity. She said, can he win? Silas said. At the county board? 3 of the 5 members bank with Dodd. Their deposits are in his institution. He doesn't need to threaten them. The relationship itself is sufficient. She said, can he win if we've executed the contract before the board meets? He said, an executed contract with the rail company creates a federal commercial interest in the property that supersedes county condemnation authority under territorial law. The board can still meet. They can still vote. but they cannot override a federally registered commercial agreement between a private landowner and an interstate rail operation. She said, "Then we execute the contract." He said, "I need to have the modifications you requested written in before you sign. I sent for the company attorney this morning. He's riding from the county seat. He'll arrive tomorrow." She said, "Tomorrow is Monday. That gives us 4 days." He said 3. "Functionally, because the county clerk's office needs a day to register the agreement." She said, "Then we have 3 days." He said, "Yes." She said, "All right." She stood up. She looked at him. She said, "He knew about the contract." Silas said, "He knew I'd offered it. He didn't know whether you'd accepted." She said, "How did he know about the offer?" He said, "The county board meeting in September. I mentioned the water access question as part of the rail development presentation. Dodd was in that room. And he is not a slow thinker," she said. "He's been waiting to see if I would sign." He said, "He assumed I hadn't told you about the rail route. He assumed you had no idea what the creek was worth. He assumed the loan pressure would move you off the property before you found out." She said, "And when the loan was paid?" He said, "He reassessed. Petition to the county board is the next fastest mechanism. It freezes the situation long enough for him to find another approach." She said, "He has a brother-in-law," he said, "Gideon Cross. Who holds the 3 foreclosed properties?" He paused. "If the county condemns your land and acquires it at assessed value, the entity that holds adjacent properties along the route becomes the logical party for a combined land transfer to the rail company. Cross's holdings become substantially more valuable." She looked at the map on the wall. She traced the route with her eyes. She saw how the pieces fit. The 3 acquired farms and her 40 acres, and the creek and the rail station, the entire valley floor assembled like a hand of cards that had been dealt one by one over 4 years. She said, "This took a long time to plan." He said, "He's been working toward it since he heard about the southern route. That's at least 3 years." She said, "Before Thomas died," he said, "the timing of your husband's loan was consistent with the beginning of the strategy." "Yes." She stood very still, not shocked. She was past the register of shock. She was in the colder, more useful register of understanding. She was thinking about the loan Thomas had taken to buy seed and repair the barn wall, the ordinary necessary loan of an ordinary necessary year, and about the penalties that had been building against it since before Thomas was in the ground, and about the long patience of a man who was willing to wait 4 years for a water source. She said, "He was counting on me failing." Silas said, "He was counting on you not knowing what you had." She said, "And now he knows I know." He said, "He knows enough, which is why he moved to the petition." She left Rim Rock Ranch in the early afternoon with the understanding that the company attorney would arrive Monday, that the modifications would be written in Monday night, and that she would come back Tuesday morning to review and sign. She rode home in the cold and the clear winter light, and she thought with a precision that surprised even her, given the circumstances, about what needed to happen in the next 72 hours and in what order. She did not sleep badly that night. She had expected to. She lay in the cold bedroom and went through the sequence of events and the decisions attached to each one. And when she was done, she found she had arrived at the same conclusions she had arrived at that morning, and the structure of them held, and she fell asleep earlier than she had in 2 weeks. Monday was paperwork. She read the modified contract with the attorney, a thin, careful man named Foster, who had the occupational caution of someone who had seen contracts fail in every possible direction and wrote accordingly. She asked questions. He answered them. She asked some of the same questions slightly differently, when she wanted to confirm that the answer was the answer, and not a version of it. He recalibrated his estimation of her upward each time, and by the end of the session was treating her with the specific respect lawyers extended to people who read every line. The modification for 12 months termination notice was in. The quarterly payment schedule was in. The inspection and drainage rights were in. There was a new clause she had requested through Silas, that the agreement included a right of first refusal for any future water access expansion, meaning the company could not negotiate additional access with anyone else without first offering her the opportunity to extend. Foster had added language that was tighter and more durable than what she had asked for, which she noted approvingly. She signed on Tuesday morning. Silas countersigned as the company's authorized representative. Foster witnessed and sealed it. Hank Deaver witnessed as a second party. She took her copy and put it in her coat pocket and felt it there, the weight of it, not heavy as paper went, but carrying the specific gravity of things that were now real and binding and done. She said, "How long for the county clerk's registration?" Foster said, "I'll ride directly to the county seat this afternoon. With standard processing, it will be registered and on record by Thursday morning." She said, "The board meets Friday." He said, "Yes." He said it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who appreciated a well-executed timeline. She said, "Will Dodd know about the registration before the board meets?" Foster said, "He will if he has someone watching the clerk's office, which I would expect he does." She said, "Good." He looked at her. She said, "I want him to know before the meeting. I want him to have to decide what to do about it. A man making decisions under time pressure with incomplete information makes different mistakes than a man who can plan." Foster looked at Silas. Silas did not look surprised. Foster said, "That is a reasonably sophisticated approach." She said, "I have 40 acres and a creek. I've had 3 years to learn to make what I have work harder than what it is." She rode home. The contract was registered Thursday, as Foster had said. Hank Deaver confirmed it, riding out in the afternoon with the news and the registered document number, which she wrote on the back of the cover page in ink and noted in the deed box index. Thursday evening, she was at the table with the last shirt, the 15th, which was Silas Thorn's shirt, cut from the remaining flannel after all other shirts were done, with the collar cut high and standing and the sleeve length 35 inches from the shoulder point and the chest measurement 49, which she had measured herself in the barn stall at Rimrock Ranch in December, with the tape from her coat pocket. She was finishing the second cuff when the dog barked. Not her dog. She did not have a dog. The sound came from down the creek road, the sharp carrying bark of Hector Pell's cattle dog, who had a radius of about a mile and rarely stirred past the Pell property line after dark. The bark was not the bark of an animal responding to wildlife. It was the bark of an animal responding to people. Moving people, more than one, coming south along the creek road in the dark. She put down the shirt. She put down the needle. She sat for a moment and she listened and she thought about the assessor's visit and about the petition to the county board and about the specific quality of a man who was running out of time and knew it. She thought, "He can't wait for Friday." She stood up. She went to the corner cabinet. She opened it and moved the spare blankets aside and she took out Thomas's Winchester, which she had cleaned and loaded 2 weeks ago when the assessor came and had kept loaded since, because she was a woman who made preparations when preparations were indicated. She checked the magazine in the dark. She knew the sound of it, the way she knew the sound of everything in this house. She put on her wool coat and her leather gloves, and she went to the door. She did not go out immediately. She went to the window first, keeping her body to the side of the frame. The night was clear and cold, the moon not yet risen, but the stars giving enough light on snow to see by. The creek glinted at the edges where the ice caught starlight. The stone boundary marker was visible at the creek bank, the marker her grandfather's men had set in 1863, the one that meant the creek was hers and not the county's and not anyone else's. 2 lanterns swinging down by the marker. 2 men, moving with the specific purposefulness of men on a job, not wandering, not lost. One was carrying something long-handled that she could not immediately identify. The other was carrying what looked like a surveyor's stake, the kind that was driven into the ground to mark a new boundary point. She understood in one breath what they were doing. If the original boundary marker was gone, and a new stake was placed closer to the house, the creek would fall on the county survey side of the line. The contract was registered. But a registered contract described the property as legally bounded. Change the physical boundary and the contract's geographic scope became contestable. It was the last available mechanism, the most direct, and the crudest, which meant the most desperate. She opened the front door. The cold hit her face like a flat hand. She stepped onto the porch. She raised the Winchester and set the stock against her shoulder and pulled the hammer back. The double click was sharp and clean in the night air, the sound of something that meant exactly what it sounded like. She called, "Step away from the marker." Her voice went out across the frozen yard and the creek and the dark without hesitation. It was not a large voice. It did not need to be. It carried the specific quality of someone who was where they were supposed to be and meant what they said. The lanterns stopped moving. The two men turned toward the house. They were too far for faces. She could see the moonlight that wasn't there yet as a faint lightening of the sky, and she could see the snow around the men, and she could see the long-handled thing in the first one's hands, which was a sledgehammer. The man called back, "County business, ma'am." "Go back inside," she said. "This is private land. You're trespassing." The man with the sledgehammer raised it. He aimed it at the stone boundary marker, the one her grandfather's surveyor had set with a level and a chain 63 years ago, and that the General Land Office had certified in 1863, and that the federal documentation in her deed box described in language that did not allow for negotiation. She aimed at the thick branch of the pine tree above the man's right shoulder, and she squeezed the trigger. The shot went out like a crack of ice in a January thaw, enormous in the cold silence, and fire jumped from the barrel, and the sound echoed off the ridge behind the house and rolled back across the valley in a long diminishing wave. The branch directly above the man with the sledgehammer shattered, and a cascade of snow and pine and bark rained down over both of them. The sledgehammer hit the ground. The second man drew a revolver. He drew it fast, with the practiced speed of a man who had drawn it before under pressure, and knew the motion. He aimed at the porch. He called out something she could not make out over the ringing in her ears. She chambered the next round without lowering the rifle. She said, "The next one goes lower than the tree." She was shaking, not from cold, from the specific physiological event of having just fired a rifle in a dark field at two unknown men who were trying to destroy her boundary marker, which was an event for which her body had appropriate responses, even if her mind was decided. Her hands were steady. The barrel did not move. The shaking was somewhere inside, underneath the steadiness, and she had put the steadiness on top of it, and the steadiness was what the men would see, and the steadiness was what mattered. Then the sound came. From the east, from the direction of the ridge road, a sound that was not wind and not the echo of the shot fading. Hoofbeats, multiple. Coming fast, not the cautious pace of riders on dark frozen ground, but the hard committed pace of riders who knew where they were going, and had been waiting for a reason to move. From the tree line at the east edge of her property, 4 horses erupted into the starlight. No lanterns. Moving at a full gallop across the snow-covered pasture toward the creek bank. At the front of them, on the black gelding she recognized from the rimrock yard, was Silas Thorn. He was not carrying a light, and he was not slowing down. He drove the gelding straight between the two men and the boundary marker, the horse's body a wall of moving muscle in the dark, and the gelding stopped on a hard rein with its hooves gouging the frozen ground and its breath steaming in great white plumes. Silas was on the ground before the horse had fully stopped, which was a movement so fast and so practiced that it suggested a man who had done it before under conditions that required speed. Hank Deaver and 2 cowboys came in from the sides, ropes already moving. Hank's lasso went out in the dark with the flat, practiced economy of a man for whom the rope was a natural extension of his arm, and it settled over the man with the revolver, with a sound like a question being answered, a dry whisper and then a snap, and the man sat down hard in the snow. The revolver hit the ground separately, which was the important part. The man with the sledgehammer was backing up. Silas walked toward him. He was not running, he did not need to run. He was walking with the deliberate, measured stride of a man who knew that the distance would close regardless, and that the pace told the other man something more useful than speed would have. The man stopped backing up. He looked at the man in front of him, the size of him in the dark, the flatness of his approach, and he stopped. Silas said, "Pick up the hammer." The man stared at him. He said it again, no louder than the first time, "Pick up the hammer." The man picked it up with both hands fumbling in the snow. His hands were shaking in a way that was visible even in starlight. Silas said, "Now walk north on the creek road until you reach town. If you stop walking before you get to the bank building, Hank will come find you, and Hank is not as patient as I am." He said this without looking at Hank. Hank, from his position in the snow with a man roped at the end of his lariat, said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence in the situation was its own argument. The man with the sledgehammer walked. He walked north with the hammer still in his hand, and he did not look back, which was the correct decision. Silas turned. He walked toward the porch at the same measured pace. The snow was blue-white in the starlight, and his boots left clean prints across it, and he was very large in the open field, the largest thing moving, and she stood on the porch with the Winchester still in her hands, and she watched him come. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. He did not immediately say anything, which was right because the moment required a second of acknowledgement before it required words. He said, "Are you all right?" she said. "Yes." "Then my ears are ringing," he said. "That fades." He stood there looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, or had seen in pieces but not assembled all at once like this. It was not relief exactly, and it was not admiration exactly. It was something that combined both, and then went further, into territory, that did not have a clean single word for it, the look of a man who had arrived somewhere he had been going, without fully admitting the direction of travel. She said, "You were already watching," he said. "Hank saw tracks on the ridge road this afternoon. 2 horses, same shod pattern as before," she said. "You knew they were coming tonight," he said. "I knew Dodd was out of options that didn't involve the dark," she said. "You could have warned me," he said. "I could have, and you would have told me you had it handled." She looked at him. He looked back at her. She was still shaking underneath the steadiness, and she thought he could probably see that, the way he saw things that other people didn't look closely enough to see. She said, "I did have it handled," he said. "Yes, you did." He said it the way he said things he meant completely, without qualification and without the impulse to add more. They stood on either side of the porch steps, with the cold between them and the horses moving in the background, and the creek running dark and cold behind the boundary marker that was still standing exactly where it had been standing since 1863, she said. "Come inside. It's cold and I need to put the rifle away and I have coffee," he said. "All right." She turned and went in, and he followed her up the steps and through the door, and the door closed behind them both, and inside the kitchen was warm from the stove she had kept burning all evening, and the lamp was on, and the 15th shirt was on the table where she had left it with the needle still threaded through the cuff. He looked at the shirt. He said, "Is that the last one?" She said, "Your cuffs still need finishing." He said, "I can wait." She put the Winchester back in the corner cabinet, and she put the blankets back over it, and she closed the cabinet door, and she stood with her back to him for a moment and let the shaking finish what it was doing, which did not take long. Then she turned around and went to the stove and poured the coffee. He had sat down at the table. He was looking at the shirt, not touching it, just looking at it the way he looked at things he was paying attention to. She set the coffee in front of him and sat across the table and wrapped both her hands around her own cup. Outside, she could hear Hank's voice and the sound of the horses being walked to the fence line and the muffled crunch of boots on frozen ground. The sounds of people who were doing what needed doing and would be out there until it was done. She said, "I'm signing tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. "I mean, I made the decision before tonight." "Tonight didn't change it," he said. "I know that too." She said, "I want you to know it wasn't fear," he said. "Nora." The first time he had used her given name, not Mrs. Hale, not the formal address of a professional arrangement, just the name, said plainly, the way you said the name of someone you were no longer maintaining a careful distance from. He said, "I know it wasn't fear. I have never once thought of you in terms of fear." She sat with that. She held it the way you held something that was unexpectedly the right weight. Outside, Hank's voice said something to the cowboys, and there was a brief exchange and then quieter, just the wind and the creek and the horses settling. She said, "Margaret," he looked at her. She said, "You said her name once. In the barn. I want to know about her, if you're willing. Not tonight, but sometime." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She would have liked you." That is not a small thing to say. She was not easily impressed. Nora looked at the lamp, at the way the flame was steady, no draft reaching it, everything outside kept out. She said, "Thomas was a good man who worked hard and died too soon. He didn't leave me much, but he left me the creek, and that turned out to be enough." He said, "It's more than enough." She said, "I'm starting to think so." Hank knocked on the door frame. He reported that the man with the rope around him had given a name for who'd sent him, and that name was the one they expected, and that he and the boys had gotten a written account of it from him and from the second man before letting them go north, with a clear instruction about what Silas would do if they came back. He said he'd have 2 men on the property line overnight, if that was agreeable to Mrs. Hale. She said it was agreeable. She said to thank them. Hank nodded and went back out. She looked at Silas across the table. She said, "In the morning we should go to Judge Price before the board meeting Friday. With the written accounts?" He said, "Yes," she said. "And we should go together." He said, "Yes," she said. "And we should bring Foster and whatever documentation he has from the registration." He said, "Already planned?" She said, "Of course it is." She looked at her coffee. She looked at the shirt. She looked at him. She said, "You planned for Friday before I did." He said, "I've been planning for Friday since I saw the petition." She said, "And you didn't tell me." He said, "I told you the important parts." She said, "There's a difference between the important parts and all of it." He's yes. "There is. I'll do better," she said. "You keep agreeing with me," he said. "You keep being right." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. The stove ticked, and the lamp was steady, and the night outside was cold and clear, and the boundary marker was still standing at the creek bank, exactly where it should be, as it had stood for 60 years, as it would stand after Friday, as it would stand after the rail line came through, and after whatever came after that. She said, "I'm going to finish the shirt," he said. "I'll sit here while you do." She picked up the needle. She finished the first cuff with the precise, steady stitching of someone who did not rush work that mattered, and she moved to the second cuff, and the lamp burned between them on the table, and he sat across from her with his coffee, and the quality of presence that she had been learning shaming the shape of for weeks now, steady and large and not requiring anything from her in exchange for being there. She did not look up from the cuff. She said, "You can stay for supper tomorrow, after we see Judge Price." He said, "All right," she said, "and the night after, if you want. There's enough stew." He was quiet for a moment. The quiet of a man who had just been offered something he had not expected and was going to accept it with the care it deserved, rather than the speed his instincts preferred. He said, "Yes, I'd like that." She did not look up. She finished the cuff. She bit the thread. She held the shirt up and turned it once in the lamplight, and it was right. All of it was right. She laid it on the table and smoothed the collar with her palm. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the creek ran beneath its ice, and somewhere north of the property line, 2 men were walking back to town in the dark with their story, and somewhere to the east, Hank Deaver and 2 cowboys were watching the fence line with the particular patient attention of men who had been asked to watch something worth watching, and inside the lamp was steady, and the stove burned, and the shirt was done. Friday arrived the way consequential days arrived in Wyoming territory, without ceremony. The same cold, the same pale sky, the same frozen road into town, the same cottonwoods with their bare branches making their bare arguments against the wind. The difference was not in the day. The difference was in what was going to happen inside it. Nora was up at 4. Not because she couldn't sleep, she had slept, which surprised her and then stopped surprising her because she had done what she needed to do, and the night on the other side of doing things was generally quieter than the night before. She dressed in the dark with the methodical attention of someone who understood that today she was going to be seen and that being seen required intention. The wool skirt was her darkest, nearly black in low light, the heavy one that held its shape through a long day without pulling at the waist. The bodice was the brown with the copper buttons, every button polished the night before with a piece of chamois she kept for the purpose. The hairnet was new, the one she had been saving since October, black and fine and tight, holding her hair with the authority of something bought for exactly this kind of day. She built the fire up and made coffee, and she stood at the kitchen window in the early dark, and she looked out at the boundary marker at the creek bank, visible even now, in the dark before dawn, as a shape against the lighter snow, the stone post her grandfather's surveyor had set in 1863. Standing. Still standing, she thought, You are still standing because of what happened last night, and because of the documentation in the deed box, and because of 6 weeks of work, and because this was always mine." She said none of this aloud. She drank her coffee. Silas arrived at 7. On the black gelding, because they were riding to town separately and meeting at Judge Price's office before the board convened. He tied the horse at the gate and came up the path and knocked with his single knuckle. And she opened the door, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was not uncomfortable, but was simply the moment before the day started, when two people who were going to do a hard thing together stood at the threshold of it and acknowledged it without needing to make a speech about it. He was wearing his best canvas duster, which was, she noted, still a canvas duster, which told you something about the man, and she had decided she approved of what it told her. Beneath it, the flannel shirt was dark green, not from her commission, one of his own, and his boots were clean, and his hat was the good one, the one with the uncreased brim that he saved for occasions. He had shaved that morning. She could see it in the line of his jaw, the clean absence of the usual winter stubble. She said, "Foster is already at Price's office." He said, "Good." She said, "I want to go through the order of presentation before we go in." He said, "Tell me," she said. "The written accounts from the 2 men last night, those go first, before anything else, before the contract, before the survey documentation. Because the accounts establish what Dodd did, directly, not through the mechanism of penalty clauses and assessment filings. Directly. Men with sledgehammers in the dark. That's not a financial dispute. That's trespass with the intent to falsify a boundary." He said, "Judge Price is going to want to know why you're bringing this to him rather than to the sheriff." She said, "Because the sheriff banks with Dodd, and because Judge Price's jurisdiction covers property disputes, and I want this resolved in the framework of property law, not criminal proceedings that can be delayed." He said, "Price will appreciate that. He doesn't like the overlap between criminal proceedings and civil land matters." She said, "I know. Reverend Cole told me." He looked at her. Something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one, the look of a man revising an estimate he had thought was already high. She said, "Are you going to tell me you already knew that?" He said, "I already knew that." She said, "Did you plan for Reverend Cole?" He said, "I hoped for him. You planned him." She considered this distinction. It was, she thought, accurate. She went to the table and picked up the deed box, which she was bringing in its entirety because there was no point in leaving anything relevant at home on a day like today. He held the door. She went out. Judge Harmon Price's office occupied the rear portion of the county building, which was a 2-room wooden structure with the county seal painted on the door and a wood stove that had not been replaced since the building was constructed 12 years ago, and showed it. Price himself was behind his desk when they arrived, Foster beside him with the documents already laid out in the order Nora had specified in her letter to Foster the previous evening. Reverend Cole was in the corner chair, which he had apparently moved there himself from its original position near the window, because he preferred not to be behind the desk line and not to be in front of it. Price was a man who had been a judge for 15 years, in a territory that had not yet settled fully into law, and who had made himself useful in the gap between what the law said and what it could actually enforce by being consistent, fair, and genuinely indifferent to whose money was in which bank. He was 71 years old and had the specific authority of a man who had outlasted several people who had tried to work around him, and was not surprised when people tried again. He looked at the documents Foster had laid out. He looked at the written accounts from the previous night, which Hank had extracted from the 2 men before releasing them, and which named Fletcher Dodd specifically as the party who had hired them and given them the boundary modification instructions. He looked at the registered easement contract. He looked at the federal survey documentation with its water rights notation in the hand of a surveyor who had been dead for 40 years and whose work was accordingly inarguable. He said, "Mrs. Hale, I have to tell you that I have seen a number of property disputes in this territory, and I have rarely seen documentation this complete," she said. "I've had some help." He looked at Silas. He looked back at her. He said, "I see that." He picked up the written accounts. He read them again. He set them down. He said, "What do you want out of this meeting this morning, before the board convenes?" She said, "I want the board to understand, before they vote on Dodd's petition, that the petition was filed as an instrument of a private scheme to acquire my land through manufactured financial pressure, and, when that failed, through direct interference with my property boundary. I want them to have the choice to vote on it with full knowledge of what it is," Price said, "and if they vote for it anyway," she said, "then I want the registered easement contract and the federal survey documentation on record as the basis for an appeal to the territorial court, and I want your recommendation attached to that appeal." Price looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You've already thought about losing," she said. "I've been a widow with a mortgaged farm for 3 years. I've thought about every version of losing there is. It doesn't mean I plan to." Reverend Cole in his corner made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite approval, and was both. Price said, "All right." He began organizing the documents with the focused efficiency of a man who had a meeting to prepare for and preferred to do it without excess conversation. He said, without looking up, "The board meeting is at 10. I'll be there. Not as a participant, as a witness with standing." Nora said, "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. This is what the office is for. That's the whole point of the office." He looked up briefly, though it's nice when someone uses it properly. They left the county building at 9:30 and walked the half block to the bank, which was where the county board met when it met on financial matters. Because the board had made this arrangement years ago with the bank's original director and had never changed it, which was now a piece of irony so complete it had almost a formal quality to it. The main street was not empty. This was, she realized, because it was Friday, and because Friday was a market day, and because Harlan's Crossing on a clear Friday morning had people in it who needed to be in town for ordinary reasons. The smithy was already smoking. Miles Corbett's Mercantile had its door propped and its shutters open. Hector Pell's wagon was at the feed store. 2 women from the North Farms were at the dry goods counter across the street. But there was also, she noticed, a quality of attention in the street that was not ordinary Friday morning attention. People who were ostensibly doing other things were arranged in ways that gave them sightlines to the bank's front door. This was a small town. Nothing was unobserved in a small town. And whatever had moved through it in the previous 24 hours, whether from Hank's Cowboys talking, or from the sound of a rifle shot carrying in cold night air, or from whatever instinct communities developed about the days when things were going to be settled, people knew something was happening and had positioned themselves accordingly. She walked down the street, and she did not look at the people looking at her, and she did not adjust her pace, and she did not in any way signal that she was aware of being watched. Because she was a Hale, and the Colonel had walked into situations where everyone was watching, and the principle was the same, whether you were leading 200 settlers through open country or walking down a frozen main street in November. You went where you were going, and you let the watching be the watching, and you've kept your eyes on the destination. Silas walked beside her. Not in front. Beside. Half a step back slightly, which was the natural result of his stride length against hers, and which he had adjusted without making an adjustment of it, which she noticed and noted. The bank's front doors were already open. The county board met in the main floor of the lobby, chairs arranged in a loose arc facing the director's desk, which was Dodd's desk, which was the piece of furniture around which this entire situation had been organized for 4 years without anyone on the right side of it knowing. The board members were already seated when Nora and Silas came in. 3 men she knew by face and name: Alderman Cray, who ran the feed store, Alderman Beckett, who had a sheep operation north of the ridge, and Alderman Moss, a retired freighter who served on the board because someone had to, and he had been volunteered at a meeting he had attended for other reasons. And 2 more she knew less well, newer to the valley, recent enough that their relationship with Dodd's bank was recent enough that she was not certain where they sat in this. Fletcher Dodd was behind his desk. He was wearing the frock coat. The watch chain was gold in the window light. He had his lawyer with him, a man from the county seat that she did not know. He had a folder of papers in front of him, and the expression of a man who had prepared for several versions of this morning and was confident in his preparation. He looked at her when she came in, and then his gaze moved to Silas, and then to Foster, and then to Judge Price, who came through the door 3 seconds behind them, and then to Reverend Cole, who came in last and took a position near the wall, with the specific presence of a man who was not there to speak, but whose being there spoke for itself. And Dodd's expression cycled through something in about 4 seconds. Confidence, first, then assessment, then a rapid internal revision that showed itself only at the corners of his mouth, a compression, the look of a man recalculating odds in real time, and finding the new numbers less comfortable than the old ones. The board convened. Alderman Cray presided because the board rotated chairs and it was Cray's month, and Cray was a decent man who ran a clean business, and had banked with Dodd because there was no other bank in 50 miles, and not because he had any particular loyalty to the man. Cray called the meeting and read the petition from the agenda. Fletcher Dodd's petition for an emergency condemnation assessment of the Hale property on grounds of public necessity for territorial rail development. Dodd's lawyer spoke first. He was competent. He presented the argument in the language of public benefit, the rail line's importance to the valley's economic development, the water access question, the necessity of the county's authority to secure critical infrastructure resources in the public interest. He was careful not to name specific amounts or specific transactions. He presented it as civic necessity. He presented Dodd as a community-minded banking officer concerned with the valley's future. Nora sat in her chair and listened to this, without her expression changing, which was something she had practiced over the years without intending to practice it. The ability to hear things said in your presence that were not true, and to receive them with the face of a woman, taking notes, rather than the face of a woman who wanted to say something. When the lawyer finished, Cray looked at the room. He said, "Is there any party withstanding to speak to the petition?" Nora stood up. She said, "I am the property owner named in the petition." Cray said, "You have the floor, Mrs. Hale." She reached into her coat and she took out the documents. Not all of them at once, in order. Because order was everything when you were presenting a case to people who needed to understand it clearly and quickly, and without the confusion that came from too much at once. First, she put the registered easement contract on Cray's table. She said, "This is a registered commercial easement agreement between myself and the Western Rail Company, executed Tuesday and registered with the county clerk Thursday. The agreement grants the company water access rights to my creek for 10 years at a fixed annual payment. It is a federal commercial agreement registered under territorial law. Under territorial statute, a registered federal commercial agreement cannot be superseded by a county condemnation proceeding without territorial court review." Dodd's lawyer was on his feet. He said, "The registration date of that agreement is subsequent to the petition filing date. The petition establishes prior interest." She said, "The petition establishes prior filing. The agreement establishes prior execution. The agreement was executed Tuesday. The petition was filed Thursday." She looked at Cray. "The timeline is documented in the registration record." Cray looked at Foster. Foster said, "That is correct. I can provide the county clerk's time-stamped registration confirmation." She reached into the deed box. "Second document. The written accounts." She said, "These are written statements from 2 men employed by a private party to enter my property on the night of December the 21st and destroy the original boundary marker for my creek access, replacing it with a new marker that would have placed the creek on the county survey side of the line." She paused. "The men named the party who hired them. The name in both accounts is Fletcher Dodd." The room was very quiet. Not the quiet of people who were shocked. The quiet of people who had suspected something and had just had the shape of it confirmed. Alderman Cray looked at the accounts. He looked at Dodd. Dodd was looking at his folder. He was very still. She reached into the deed box again. Federal survey documentation. The water rights notation in the hand of a dead federal surveyor 60 years gone. She placed it on Cray's table and she said, "This is the original 1863 boundary survey for my property, certified copy from the General Land Office in Cheyenne. The water rights notation grants the creek access in perpetuity to the title holder. Not to the county, not to the bank, to whoever holds the title." She sat down. The room was still very quiet. Outside, through the bank's thick walls, she could hear the street. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Friday morning, The distant ring of the smithy, a wagon passing, someone's boot heels on the boardwalk. The sounds of a town going about its business while something was decided in here that would change how the business went. Judge Price spoke from his position near the wall. He said, "I want the board to understand my presence here. I have reviewed the documentation that Mrs. Hale has presented this morning, and I can confirm its authenticity. I am particularly directing the board's attention to the written accounts of the boundary interference. This is not a zoning dispute or a valuation question. This is documented trespass and deliberate falsification of a recorded property boundary, committed at the direction of the petitioner." He paused. "The board may vote as it sees fit on the petition. I am noting for the record that a vote in favor of the petition, given this documentation, will be reviewed by the Territorial Court on appeal with my full support for that review." Alderman Beckett, who had been silent until this moment, said, "Fletcher, do you want to speak to the accounts?" Dodd looked up from his folder. He looked at the room. He looked at Reverend Cole against the wall, who had not moved and had not spoken, and whose presence in the room had the quality of a moral fact being present, not an argument, just a presence, the way a witness was a presence, the way the community's memory of itself was a presence. He looked at Cray. He said, "I would like to request a postponement of the vote pending review of the new documentation." Cray said, "The petition sets a deadline of January 15th. A postponement would put the vote after the deadline." Dodd said, "That is acceptable." Cray looked at the board. He looked at the accounts. He looked at the contract. He said, "I'm going to call for a vote on whether to table the petition indefinitely." The vote was 4-1. The one was the newer member whose relationship with Dodd's bank Nora had not been certain about, and whose vote was now information she filed and noted and would remember. The petition was tabled, which meant it was gone. A tabled petition past its operative deadline was not a sleeping petition that could be revived. It was a record that would sit in the county files, with the written accounts attached and the registered easement contract beside it, and anyone who ever tried to move against the Hale property's water rights in the future would find that record first, and would understand what it meant. Dodd stood up. His lawyer gathered the folder. The room was very quiet. Not hostile, not triumphant. Just quiet, in the way that a room was quiet when something had been settled and everyone present understood that it was settled and that the next thing was going to be the return to ordinary life. Clara Dodd was standing near the bank's side door. Nora had not seen her come in. She was standing there with her fur-trimmed coat and her feathered hat and her hands at her sides, not holding anything, not performing anything. She looked at Nora, and Nora looked at her, and Clara opened her mouth and said, carefully, in the tone of a woman choosing every word, "I am sorry for what was said in the store." Not the acknowledgement she had offered at the farmhouse. An apology. The real word, said in a room with witnesses. Nora said, "I appreciate that." She meant it the way she had meant the smaller thing before, and she meant it more than she had meant the smaller thing, because an apology in public from a woman who had been cruel in public was a different order of thing than a private acknowledgement, and she recognized the courage in it, even if she did not yet know what to do with it. Clara nodded. She went out the side door. The conversation it opened between them would come later, in smaller increments, in the way that things between women who had started badly found their way forward, if both of them were willing to be the person who moved. Nora was willing, in principle. In practice was a matter of time. The room dispersed. Board members gathered their coats. Foster began collecting his documents with the careful efficiency of a man who had watched this go better than the most optimistic scenarios he had constructed, and was appropriately satisfied. Judge Price shook Nora's hand without ceremony, the handshake of a man confirming a professional interaction that had gone as it should, and left. Reverend Cole came across the room. He said, "Your grandfather would have recognized what you did this morning." He said it simply, without inflation, the way he said true things. He put his hat on and went out. Miles Corbett was on the boardwalk when Nora came out the bank's front door into the cold morning light. He was not the only one. Several of the people who had been positioned on the street were still positioned on the street, and they had the look of people who had been waiting for a door to open and had their answer now in the quality of the people who came through it, The way you could read a result in the faces that emerged from a room without having been inside. Miles said, "Well," he said it with the barely contained anticipation of a man who had spent an hour waiting and was not constituted for waiting. She said, "The petition was tabled." He let out a breath. He said, "Good." He said it with the whole weight of a decent man who had been watching something unjust proceed for longer than he liked and was relieved to see it stop. He looked at Silas, who had come out behind her. He said, "Good morning, Mr. Thorn." Silas said, "Morning, Miles." Miles looked between them. He looked at the boardwalk. He said, "I have that harness buckle set aside still, Nora. Been there since September." He said it without looking up, in the tone of a man making a factual statement about inventory. She said, "I'll take it today." She meant it. She could afford it now. She had been able to afford it for 2 weeks. Since the first quarterly payment from the easement agreement had been deposited with the county clerk as part of the registration, because Foster had inserted a clause requiring an advance payment against the first quarter to establish the commercial relationship as active, which she had thought was a drafting decision, and had subsequently understood was Foster's way of ensuring she had working capital before the board meeting. She went into the mercantile with Miles, and he went behind the counter and found the buckle on the shelf, where he had been keeping it for 3 months, and placed it on the glass countertop with the care of a man who had kept something for a long time and was glad to see it go to its right place. She paid him. She put the buckle in her coat pocket. She thought about Thomas buying the harness in the first year they had the farm, the good harness, the one that had outlasted him and would outlast the buckle she was replacing now. The way good things outlasted the people who chose them when the people who came after took care of what they'd left. When she came out of the mercantile, Silas was still on the boardwalk. He had not gone anywhere. He was leaning against the post with his hat pushed back slightly, and his arms crossed and his eyes on the street, the specific posture of a man who was waiting for something and was comfortable waiting. She came to stand beside him, and they stood looking at the street together for a moment. She said, "You could have told the board yourself. About the rail company. About the scheme." He said, "I could have." She said, "Why didn't you?" He said, "Because it was your land, your water, your case to make," she said. "You were in there. You could have." He said, "Nora, I own a controlling interest in the rail company. I have 40 times what Dodd has in assets, and I am 6'4". If I walk into a room and present a case, the room hears a powerful man making an argument. If you walk in and present a case with this documentation, the room hears the truth." He looked at her. "Those are different things. The truth was the thing that needed to be heard." She stood with that. She stood with it the way she stood with things that required her to revise an understanding she had been building carefully. The revision not undoing the building, but adding to it. Another course of stone on a wall that was becoming something solid and real, she said. "That is either very wise or a very sophisticated sounding way of saying, 'You knew I didn't need your help.'" He said both, simultaneously. She said, which was not agreement and not disagreement, and was the sound she made when she was giving something real consideration. The street went on around them. Hector Pell came out of the feed store with a grain sack on each shoulder, moving with the steadiness of a man who had been carrying things since before Nora was born and saw no reason to change the approach. 2 of the Pratt boys ran across the road, chasing something with wheels that had gotten away from them. The smithy rang its iron note and rang it again. Ordinary. All of it ordinary. The Friday morning of a small town in Wyoming territory going about the business of being a small town. And inside that ordinary there was this, a registered commercial agreement, a boundary marker standing intact at a creek bank, a deed box with its full documentation, and a conversation happening on a boardwalk between 2 people who had started 6 weeks ago in a store where a terrible thing was said and had ended up here, in the cold morning light, standing side by side outside a mercantile. She said, "Supper tonight." He said, "Yes," she said, "and you should bring an extra coat. The north wind comes through the kitchen window at that corner, and I haven't fixed the frame yet." He said, "I'll look at the frame." She said, "I didn't ask you to." He said, "You told me about the frame." She said, "I was explaining the window." He said, "You were explaining the window by telling me there was a problem with it." She looked at him. He looked back at her. He was entirely correct, which was irritating in the specific way of a man who was right about the thing he was right about without being smug about being right, which left no comfortable position for objecting. She said, "Fine, look at the frame," he said. "I'll bring wood for the repair." She said, "You don't need," he said, Nora. She stopped. He said, "Let me fix the window." She looked at the street. She looked at her boot toes on the frozen boardwalk. She thought about 3 years of fixing everything herself, not because there was no one to ask, but because asking required the admission that she could not do it alone, and admitting that had felt for 3 years like a form of losing. She thought about how wrong that accounting was, how the arithmetic of needing help had nothing to do with the arithmetic of being capable, how those two things lived in entirely different columns. She said, "All right, just that." 2 words. But they were the right 2 words, and they both knew it. Spring came the way spring came in Wyoming, incrementally, and then all at once. The creek running free first, and then the south-facing slopes clearing, and then one morning the meadow behind the farmhouse was green instead of brown, and the cottonwoods had their new leaves, and the air smelled of things growing rather than things preserved against the cold. The pipe installation began in April. Silas's crew worked carefully, as the contract specified, as she had required, following the line she had walked with the foreman 3 times before they broke ground, the line that stayed to the property's eastern margin and did not cross the drainage pattern of the central pasture. They were good workers. They did not require supervision. She watched them from a distance the first day, and then not at all after that, because there was nothing to watch for. They were doing what they had been contracted to do and doing it correctly. Silas came on Wednesdays and Sundays. The Wednesdays were practical, checking on the installation, reviewing the quarterly accounting, the ordinary work of 2 people with a shared business arrangement. The Sundays were not particularly about any of that. The Sundays were what they were, which was 2 people eating supper in a kitchen where the north window had been properly repaired in January and no longer let the wind in, and talking about the valley and the ranch and things that happened in a life, and the things that happened in a life when the immediate crisis had resolved and the longer, quieter life had resumed. She had begun to know him. Not the version of him that was visible, the size, the deliberateness, the controlled economy of movement, the version underneath. The man who had opinions about horses that were strong enough to constitute beliefs. The man who had been reading the same volume of Emerson for 2 years, not because it was long, but because he read it slowly and with tension, and went back to passages he had read before and found new things in them. The man who made exactly 2 kinds of jokes, both dry enough that they sometimes went past people who weren't listening for them, and both, she had found, actually funny. She had told him about Thomas. Not all of it at once. In pieces, the way you told things to someone who was going to be around for all the pieces, over weeks, over suppers, over the ordinary accumulation of time spent in the same rooms. Thomas's good nature and his practicality and the specific way he had of seeing a problem from the angle that made it most manageable. His patience with the hard winters. The way he had stacked the firewood in the lines she still stacked it in, not because she couldn't change the pattern, but because the pattern was good and she saw no reason to change what worked. Silas listened to this the way he listened to everything, with the attention of a man who understood that what a person told you about the people they had loved was the deepest form of self-description, and who treated it accordingly. He told her about Margaret in the same way, over time. The pieces coming as they came, not forced, not avoided. Margaret's humor, which had apparently been sharper and faster than anyone expected from a woman who looked as gentle as she had. Her competence with horses, which had been better than Silas's, which he said with the honest appreciation of a man who had made his own peace with that fact. The specific color of January when she died. The way the ranch had felt in the weeks after, when its size had changed from an achievement into an expanse. This was how they learned each other, in the way that mattered. In the things that had already happened, rather than the things that were being performed. In June she said yes to a question he had not quite asked, which was the accurate description of what happened, which was that they were sitting on the repaired porch in the June evening, with the meadow, green to the tree line, and the creek audible in the distance, and Silas had said, with the looking at the middle distance quality he used for the things he had been thinking about for a long time. I would like this to be a permanent arrangement. And she had said, define permanent. And he had said, not 10 years, not 20 years with renewal options. He looked at her. Permanent, and she had said, the farmhouse stays. The deed stays in my name. And he had said, obviously, and she had said, you'll need a larger chair for the kitchen. That one is not built for you. And he had said, I'll build one. And she had said, yes, which was the second time she had said yes in that way, which was the way of a woman who had decided and was not going to add unnecessary words to the decision. He had looked at her, and she had looked at him. And the June evening had continued its business around them. The meadow and the creek and the last light on the ridge, and that was the end of the uncertainty and the beginning of the other thing. Reverend Cole married them in July. The church was full, which she had not expected and then had understood, because the valley had been watchwafer and had seen what it had seen, and communities were like that. They showed up for the conclusions to the stories they had been following. Miles Corbett sat in the third pew with his good coat and his emotion visibly managed, and not quite successfully managed, which she found entirely appropriate. Hank Deaver stood at the front, because someone had to stand at the front and he had been chosen, and he stood there with his hat in his hands, in the specific posture of a man who had been moved by something and was going to stand there and be moved by it, rather than pretend otherwise. The summer went. The fall came. The pipe ran water to the new station with the reliability that her grandfather's surveyor had documented 60 years before. The creek unchanged by decades and people, and the various schemes that had been organized around it, running clear and steady and exactly sufficient the way it had always run. In October she knew. She knew the way you knew things that happened in your own body, the specific way this kind of knowing arrived, quiet and certain and without drama. She sat with it for 2 days before she said anything, not from uncertainty but from the desire to be sure of her own certainty before she said the words that would change the shape of everything again. Silas was mending fence on the east line, the section that bordered the installation road, when she walked out to him on a Tuesday afternoon. He saw her coming and straightened up from what he was doing. He waited. He had the quality she had been learning the full dimensions of, the ability to wait for what was coming, rather than walking toward it before it arrived. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him in the October light, the good flat western light that showed everything clearly without flattering it, the light under which she had made most of the real decisions of her adult life. She said, "You're going to need to build something besides a chair." He looked at her. He was very still. The stillness of a man receiving information that was reorganizing everything behind his eyes in real time. He said, "When?" She said, "Spring." He stood there in the October afternoon with the fence wire in his hands and his eyes on her face, and she watched him work through it, the accounting of it, the weight of it, everything it meant, given what he had lost and what this was. He put the wire down on the fence post carefully. He crossed the distance between them. He was very large in the afternoon light, the largest thing in the field, and she was not small, but she was smaller. And he stood in front of her, and he put both his hands on her face, the big calloused hands that fixed fences and wrote freight contracts, and had held the measuring tape still while she put it around him in a barn stall in December. And he said, "A boy or a girl?" She said, "I have no idea." He said, "Either one." She said either one and meant it. They walked back to the house together through the October grass, which was still green at the roots where the summer's warmth had held, and the creek ran alongside the south field in its steady, unremarkable way, and the station a mile to the east sent up its first train of the day, with the sound of a whistle that carried across the whole valley, a long, clean note that was new enough to be remarkable, and would become, she knew, as ordinary as the creek's sound inside of a season, the way everything that lasted became part of the ordinary music of a place. On the shelf above the kitchen stove, beside the wooden box that held the colonel's cavalry medal and his land grant and the faded parchment that bore his surveyor's signature, she had placed one more thing in September, when she had found it in the bottom of the sewing box, tucked under the spare bobbins and the needles and the bone buttons that were left over from projects completed and past. It was a small piece of wool, gray, the particular gray of a dress that had been a neighbor girl's, and then let down and taken in and altered until it had no more life left in it. The color of creek water in January. There was a seam repair visible on it, done in black thread because the gray had run out, the stitching tight and deliberate and almost invisible to anyone who hadn't done work like that and knew where to look. She had put it there not as a relic of something hard, but as the record of a specific truth, that she had stood in a store in November with her coins stacked on a glass counter, and her worn hem and her re-soled boots, and she had looked at a woman who thought she knew exactly what she was seeing, and neither of them had known yet that what Nora Hale was holding, in those 40 acres, and that running creek, and in the quality of her own spine, was the thing that everything else was going to be built around. The gray wool stayed on the shelf through winter, and would stay through spring, and through the summer that came after, through the arrivals and departures and the ordinary accumulation of a life being lived in the same place where a life had always been lived, because it was the first thing, the thing before the red flannel and the contract and the Friday morning at the bank, the thing that had been true before anyone knew it needed to be. Some things you held, not because they were beautiful, because they were true, and the truth of them did not diminish with time. It accumulated, the way a creek accumulated water, from sources that were not dramatic and were not loud, and ran clear and steady and sufficient, exactly as long as it needed to.